Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we drift into the mist-soaked streets of a medieval port city, the kind where the cobblestones sweat in the fog and the river smells faintly of iron. The lanterns sway in the damp wind, each one drawing pale halos in the night air, and the only footsteps belong to those desperate enough to be out after curfew. You probably want to know this. Most people in these streets are either going to the apothecary or the graveyard, and sometimes both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love it if you told me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fog moves first, rolling low, curling like lazy smoke from an unseen fire. Then comes the figure, cloaked in a heavy wool coat, the hem darkened by damp and street grime, and topped with that long bird-like mask. It gleams faintly under the weak light as he steps from the shadows, a slow, deliberate gait that draws the eyes of a weary night watchman leaning on his spear. The mask's beak curves downward, stuffed with a hidden mix of dried herbs, vinegar-soaked cloth, and something no one in this port has smelled before. Behind the glass eye lenses, the doctor's gaze scans the narrow alley, every window shutter pulled tight, every door barred from the inside. His arrival has been whispered about for days, the way people whisper about a comet or an ill-omened dream. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, when plague rolls in like weather and leaves towns hollowed out like burned logs. Historians still argue whether this city was on the main trade route or just an unlucky stopover for infected ships. What is certain is that rats came ashore long before the alarm bells rang, and by the time the council realized what was happening, half the dock workers were coughing blood. Our masked traveler arrived without escort, stepping off a modest fishing vessel at dawn. The captain swore he had paid in gold florins, and that he carried nothing but a small trunk and a rolled sheepskin satchel. No one could say where he had been before, though one deckhand muttered about hearing him mutter to the sea at night. The port was a place of smells, brine from the tide, pitch from ship hulls, spices from distant markets, and yet his scent cut through it, sharp rosemary, biting camphor, and an undertone that no one could place. When he passed a fishmonger sweeping the stoop, she crossed herself, then leaned inside to bolt the door. In a time when most physicians still clung to Galen's humoral theory, balancing black bile and phlegm with leeches and vomit draughts, his approach was different. He did not carry leech jars. He did not speak of bad air in vague terms, though the mask might suggest otherwise. Instead, he spoke in measured, almost bored tones, asking about symptoms with precision and scribbling notes in a narrow leather book that smelled faintly of lamp oil. By midday, word of his presence had reached the council chamber, a low, timbered hall where 3 aldermen and the harbour master were arguing about quarantining incoming ships. The last thing they wanted was a stranger stirring the pot. And yet, as the sun set, the masked doctor walked unchallenged through the gate into the poorer quarter, where the sickness bloomed fastest. He stopped at the corner of Ropemaker's Lane and Salt Alley, where a cart stood with a body covered in sackcloth. From the shadows, someone called out in a thin voice, asking if he was the healer they'd been promised. Without answering, he knelt, pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from his satchel, and began setting out small jars and folded papers. Here's the quirky part. Plague doctors of the time often filled their beaks with sweet herbs to protect themselves from miasma, but this one burned sprig of juniper right there in the street, holding the smoke over his patient as if testing the air. The watchman later swore he saw him sprinkle some sort of powder into the dying man's mouth, though no one could identify it later. By the time he finished, the sackcloth had been removed, the man's breathing steadier, his eyes following the doctor's every movement. The masked figure packed his tools, adjusted his cloak, and moved on without asking for payment. The watchman, unnerved, followed at a distance until the doctor turned a corner and was simply gone. Some swore he took to the rooftops. Others claimed he vanished into the fog, but those who saw him that night would later say the same thing. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly how much time he had before the city's gates closed to him. And somewhere, deep in the twisting back streets, a candle burned low in an upper floor window, while the sound of grinding mortar stone carried faintly through the night air. The masked doctor was just getting started. Inside his rented quarters above a cooper's workshop, the masked doctor moved like a man arranging a chessboard. Only he could see. The space was narrow, with a single crooked window overlooking the rain-darkened alley below. Damp had curled the edges of the plaster, and the smell of tar from the barrels downstairs hung thick in the air. Still, he worked with methodical care, as if this room had been built for this exact purpose. On the table lay his tools, not the crude iron tongs or bone saws the city surgeons prized, but slender instruments of polished brass and bone, each wrapped in oiled cloth. Beside them, small glazed jars lined up like soldiers, labeled in a script no one in the city could read. Some bore scents the neighbors might recognize: thyme, sage, lavender, while others gave off acrid metallic tangs that made the eyes water. He reached into the satchel and withdrew a bundle wrapped in waxed linen. Unfolding it, revealed a neat stack of thin, paper-like sheets. They were in fact pressed petals, each dusted with a fine crystalline powder. As he laid them out, he hummed something low, almost tuneless, but in a rhythm that suggested memory rather than improvisation. Mainstream historical fact: plague doctors often believed fumigation was a cure, burning herbs, incense, and even old clothes to drive out the bad air. Yet this man didn't simply burn them. He combined them in small ceramic cups, heating each until the oils released, then trapping the vapor under a bell jar to infuse strips of cloth. Later, those strips would line his patients' breathing masks, keeping them close to the vapors long after he left. A brass mortar sat in the center of the table, its surface pitted from years of use. Into it he dropped dried marigold, powdered myrrh, and an unidentifiable flake of something black and glassy. The pestle ground slow and steady, each press producing a faint hiss, as if the ingredients exhaled under the pressure. He worked mostly in silence, pausing only to mark small notes in the narrow leather book. The pages were divided, not by illness, but by something stranger: moon phases, tides, wind direction. Historians still argue whether these were superstitious additions or part of an actual medical system lost to time. What they agree on is that no other surviving medical record from the era uses such a combination. From beneath the table, he drew a shallow wooden chest. Its interior was sectioned into compartments, each holding a different resin or mineral. One square contained a lump of bright green malachite, another a crumbly red ochre, and another what looked alarmingly like a fragment of dried animal heart. The doctor handled each with the same calm precision, weighing tiny portions on a balanced scale made of horn. And here's the quirky part: he kept a small birdcage near the window, and inside was not a bird but a sprig of rosemary tied to the perch. Each morning he would open the cage, replace the sprig, and mutter something under his breath before discarding the old one out the window. Some scholars think this was a primitive form of air quality testing. If the rosemary wilted too quickly, the air was considered dangerous. Others believe it was just a personal ritual, part of a mental checklist before venturing into the plague-ridden streets. By lamplight, he filled small paper packets with the powdered mixtures, sealing them with drops of melted beeswax. These would be slipped into pockets, worn under clothing, or dissolved in heated wine for those strong enough to swallow. The work required patience. Any imbalance could spoil the batch. Every so often he paused to sniff the air, not in the casual way one checks for a draft, but in slow, deliberate draws through the filters in his mask. When the smell shifted, less smoke from the docks, more of the sweet rot from the poorer quarter, he would glance toward the window as if marking the disease's advance. He lifted the bell jar from one cup of herbs, releasing a thin coil of aromatic steam. The scent was sharp, but oddly pleasant, a mix of pine resin and something citrus-like. He leaned over it, inhaled deeply, then lowered a strip of cloth into the cup, letting it drink in the vapor. When he pulled it free, the fabric glistened faintly, as if damp with morning dew. This, he knew, would hold its potency for days. Somewhere below, a cart rumbled past, the driver calling out in a voice cracked by the cold. A knock followed, not at his door, but on the shutter from the alley side. He crossed the room without haste, and opened it just enough to accept a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. No words were exchanged. The hand that passed it in vanished into the fog. Inside the bundle were roots, twisted, black, and faintly luminous in the lamplight. The kind of thing that didn't grow anywhere near this city. He turned them over in his gloved hands, the texture oddly warm, before setting them in the chest's final empty compartment. With the preparations complete, he extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint glow from the coals in the hearth. He did not sleep in a bed, but in a straight-backed chair, mask still in place, hands folded as if ready to rise at the next knock. Outside, the fog thickened, curling under the door, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells tolling for the dead. Inside, the air hung heavy with rosemary, juniper, and secrets. At dawn the harbour woke in coughs and clanks, ropes slapping wet wood, gulls soaring the sky with their hungry complaints. The masked doctor stepped from his stairwell into that cold breath of salt and rot, carrying his satchel like a priest carries a reliquary. Ropemaker's Lane bled into the wharf, and there, under a stretched sailcloth, lay the dockworker everyone had already abandoned in their minds. He was a barrel of a man reduced to a bucket, cheeks fallen in, eyes too bright, the swelling at his groin bandaged with linen gone the colour of bad tea. His sister hovered nearby with a basin, water shivering in it, because her hands would not stop shaking. The watchman from 2 nights before stood across the way pretending to inspect a broken cart axle. The apothecary's apprentice, a boy who wore a cap the size of a pie, lurked at the edge of the crowd with a satchel of theriac and pride. Theriac, that celebrity syrup of the age, with dozens of ingredients, and even rumours of viper flesh, had not helped. Everyone had watched it fail enough times to avoid eye contact when it did. The doctor knelt beside the pallet and did what he had done in alleys and kitchens all week, measured the breath, counted the pulse, pressed for pain with gloved fingers and waited for the flinch. He checked the heat at the wrists, the sourness of the breath, the tenderness around the nodes. Mainstream fact, tucked in kindly among the tools of storytelling. The common sign was the bubo, a swollen lymph node in the groin, armpit, or neck, and it could be the size of a pigeon egg or larger. He traced the outline without hurry and watched the man's eyes roll with the dull fury of the fevered. From the satchel came the infused cloth strips he had prepared the night before, still carrying that pine citrus bite. He tied one over the patient's mouth and nose, shifted his head to widen the airway, then set a small brazier under the tented sailcloth and fed it splinters of juniper. The smoke curled and thinned, fragrant without choking. He arranged ceramic cups with decoctions, one warm as tea and another thick as resin, and placed beside them a small vial the colour of straw. The sister tried to speak and swallowed the words like gristle. The doctor acknowledged her with a tilt that was almost kind and gestured toward the basin. He poured in vinegar and a pinch of salt, then washed his gloves, then the man's hands, then, with a deliberate gentleness that felt like apology, the skin around the bubo. He murmured a cadence beneath the mask, not quite prayer, not quite the hum from his workroom, a rhythm to keep the steps precise. He lanced, but not in the sloppy way of hurried barber surgeons. He drew the heat away first, layered poultice over the site, leached from cloth, replaced, waited, then made a small opening and wicked the fluid into a wad of wool steeped in wine. He worked behind the screen of juniper, where the vapour rose steady and antiseptic in ambition, if not in name. The watchman took a half-step closer, and then remembered his own lungs and stopped. The apothecary's boy fidgeted, clutching his theriac, blinking hard because the man on the pallet kept not dying. He had seen many versions of this scene end with a shudder and silence, and a quick, embarrassed dispersal. This, instead, drifted into an exhale that was long and unbroken by the rattling stop-start of the dying. The doctor timed it with 2 fingers on the pulse, counted in his book with the neat, crabbed script, then held the straw-coloured vial to the man's lips. A few drops, a rest, a few more. He did not force the swallow, just waited for the throat to do its small work. Quirky tidbit for the bedside. Some dock crews in those years stitched emerald chips into their caps, believing the stone would warn of poison by sweating or cracking. One of the onlookers swore the emerald on his ring went cool when the doctor opened his vial, and for weeks afterward he tapped the gem like a nervous habit, as if begging it for commentary. The doctor ordered, with gestures honed by necessity, what anyone could understand: boil the linens, burn the rags that touched the wound, ventilate the tented space like a sail, keep a pot of wine simmering with rosemary near the palate, and change the infused strip twice a day, wash hands in vinegar between every kindness. These were steps even a frightened sister could manage, and she clung to them like a list of prayers. By noon the fever had levelled, by dusk it had fallen enough to let sleep come like a tide, not a drowning. Historians still argue whether the improvement owed to drainage, to the antiseptic effect of the heated aromatics, to blind luck, or to a regimen that quietly undercut the fleas and filth carrying the disease from nest to nest. Ports had begun, here and there, to toy with isolation as a civic tool, and in a few decades the famous 40 days would harden into policy, a quarantainer with guard towers and ledgers and posted fines. For now, the doctor built a private quarantine with a sailcloth and a sister's will. On the second day, the dockworker woke hungry enough to scowl at thin broth. He sat with help, inspected his own bandage as if it had insulted him, and asked for work in a voice sleep had sanded smooth. The watchman posted himself nearby to pretend this was a miracle he deserved to witness by virtue of his uniform. The apothecary's boy returned with his master, who stood with arms folded, frown folding further, calculating whether to denounce or to recruit. The doctor seemed allergic to both conversations, and simply checked the pulse, counted the respirations, replaced the strip, and shifted the brazier to follow the wind. By the third day the man swung his legs to the ground and put weight on them with a pilot's caution. The burbo had softened under careful wicking and no longer burned like a coal. He walked the length of the wharf and back, hand on his sister's shoulder, not triumphant but surprised, as if finding an old path swept clear. The crowd scattered and then reformed behind him, everyone suddenly very busy with very public tasks that happened to orbit his steps. This city was skilled at pretending not to stare. News ran faster than rats. By evening a cooper's apprentice told a baker's aunt, told a clerk's lover, told the alderman's maid that the masked doctor had made a dead man stand. At the tavern the story grew wings and feathers, and by the time it reached the guild hall, the dockworker had leaped a stack of barrels and wrestled death into the river. Gentle sarcasm belongs here like a spice in a stew. No one mentioned the basil-scented cloths or the boiling buckets, because those were not heroic, and heroism makes better evening entertainment than hygiene ever will. The apothecaries went home tight-lipped and scalded their measures as a show. They had vials to sell, after all, and reputations buttered on habit. Their theriac could not afford to be publicly second best to some stranger's vinegar and rosemary. Two of them sent runners with polite inquiries that were daggers wrapped in lace. One sent a thicker man with shoulders like stacked plates to stand outside the cooper's workshop and look as if he could outstare smoke. The sister obeyed every instruction with the solemnity of oath. She burned the first bandage with her own hands, watched ash leap, and felt, for the first time in weeks, that she had a lever against this sickness, even if it was only a pot of simmering wine and a roll of infused cloth that smelled like a forest in rain. She did not ask about the straw-coloured vial. The doctor had left a single drop in it as if to prove that scarcity could be kind. By week's end, the dockworker returned to light duty, hauling half-loads with a stubborn dignity that told everyone he had already fought the harder work and won. The watchman, who had no words for gratitude that would not embarrass him, began patrolling a little closer to Ropemaker's Lane. The baker sent over 2 loaves that had somehow become 4 by the time they arrived. The masked doctor accepted none of it, left the loaves on the sill for the cooper's wife, and wrote in his book under the mark for west wind and low tide. A small coda perched at the edge of the miracle like a gull on a piling. That night, as lanterns were snuffed and shutters thudded home, the dockworker's sister heard her brother murmur something as he drifted towards sleep. It was not a prayer, she knew. It sounded like the end of a lullaby, syllables pressed together in a way that felt older than the street's cobbles. She dismissed it as fever echo, the mind tidying up. After all, he had been very ill, and the body says strange things when it comes back from the river's far bank. The doctor, upstairs, ground a new mixture in the brass mortar, the pestle hissing like before, and paused only once to hold a strip of cloth over the fumes. The rosemary in the cage by the window looked unusually fresh for a sprig with its roots in nothing but air. He made a note. Somewhere below, a man who was not supposed to be walking walked, and that was enough reason to keep the fire banked, the satchel packed, and the steps quiet for the night to come. The market square of this city was never quiet, even under the shadow of sickness. Stalls sagged under thin piles of onions and turnips. Barrels of dried fish sat open to the air, and the smell of baking bread fought a losing battle against the stench from the tanner's yard. Merchants bickered, apprentices ran errands, and mothers dragged their children past the sharper corners of conversation. But lately, between the calls for apples and the clang of scales, a new thread had woven into the noise. A peculiar phrase passed from mouth to mouth like a coin of no known mint. It began with the dock worker. By the second week of his recovery, he could be found leaning on the rail by the fishmongers, swapping stories with other labourers, sipping thin ale in the sun, and sometimes, without seeming to realise it, he'd mutter the words, 3 short syllables, rising and falling like a question that already knew its answer. When asked what he'd said, he frowned, genuinely puzzled, and claimed he hadn't spoken at all. But others started to echo him. A tanner's boy, cured of a sudden fever after a visit from the masked doctor, was heard whispering it while tying off a bundle of hides. A seamstress, whose cough had eased under his care, found herself murmuring it over her needlework, the sound barely louder than the rustle of cloth. Even the baker's aunt, hale for years, was overheard saying it under her breath while counting change. Mainstream historical fact during the Black Death and later outbreaks. Communities often invented charms, prayers, or rhymes to ward off the disease, some as nonsense syllables, others drawn from Latin or local dialects. They could spread faster than the illness itself, sometimes lingering in folk songs long after the cause was forgotten. This phrase, however, did not match any known tongue in the region, nor Latin, nor the traders' French that clung to the port. Quirky tidbit: an apprentice glassblower swore that when his mother spoke the phrase in her sleep, a drop of molten glass he was working cooled into a perfect sphere without him shaping it. He kept it in a pouch around his neck, rubbing it like a talisman before each day's work. Whether coincidence or something stranger, he could never replicate the sphere again. The whispers troubled the apothecaries more than the doctor's quiet successes. Remedies were one thing, those could be copied, sold, or discredited, but an untraceable, unteachable word passed from patient to patient felt like something else entirely. A few muttered that it smacked of incantation, the sort that drew the church's gaze like flies to a honeypot. Historians still argue whether this detail was embroidered later, but one surviving council record makes a sly reference to an unlicensed litany in circulation among the cured. At his quarters above the cooper's workshop, the masked doctor kept no sign of the phrase. His leather book recorded wind, tides, moon phases, symptoms and mixtures, but no word that matched what the patients were saying. If it concerned him, he gave no outward sign. He came and went as before, his satchel swinging in the same measured rhythm, his mask catching the same warped reflections from shop windows. Still, the scribe the council had quietly assigned to shadow him began to hear it too, not from the doctor, but from the people who lingered in his wake. The scribe was a thin man with ink-stained fingers, fond of wide hats and narrow shoes, who could sit on a bench for hours pretending to read while his ears drank everything. He began noting the phrase's appearances in his own cramped journal, marking not only who said it, but where, when, and, most unsettling, what they were doing at the time. The list grew by the day. On market day, the scribe watched a cured seamstress pass a cobbler in the square. They didn't speak, didn't even make eye contact, but both, within a heartbeat of each other, mouthed the phrase like a reflex. That night, the scribe sat by candlelight, replaying it in his mind until he caught himself whispering it into the quiet room. The sound felt satisfying, as though it slotted into some hidden hinge in the skull. The council chambers were another matter. Inside that timbered hall, under the smell of beeswax and damp wool, the word was never spoken, but its presence lingered in the frowns and sidelong glances whenever the doctor's name was mentioned. The aldermen could not ban a syllable, but they could watch, and waiting had its own power. The church, too, had its ears. A confessor assigned to the docks noted the rise of idle murmurings among certain recovered souls. His report sent to the bishop described a tone neither prayer nor curse, yet spoken with the same compulsion as either. The bishop, no stranger to the ways of fear, marked it for later inquiry, and turned back to the matter of a ship arriving from the south. In the square, life went on. Barrels rolled, loaves baked, fish were gutted, and still the word wound itself through the day like an invisible thread. A boy chased a hoop through a knot of gossiping women, one of whom let the syllables slip between talk of rent and weather. A sailor carved it into the rail of his ship, not knowing why, and later rubbed at it until the wood splintered under his thumb. By late summer, the phrase had travelled beyond the city. Traders carried it on their tongues into neighbouring ports, where it was picked up by stable boys and innkeepers who had never heard of the masked doctor, and yet, when asked, they could not recall where they'd learned it. The dock worker, now fully returned to his labour, swore he'd never said it in his life, though his sister had caught him murmuring it in his sleep, the sound faint under the crackle of the hearth. She did not press him. In these times there were already too many questions without answers. And through it all, the doctor moved unbothered, as though the market's growing undercurrent was nothing more than background noise. If he noticed the way people stiffened when he passed, or the quick, furtive motions of fingers forming the shape of the word against their palms, he gave no sign. His work continued, his remedies worked, and somewhere in the hum of the city, the phrase kept weaving itself into the breath of the living. By the time the gulls learned the rhythm of his footsteps, the council had learned the rhythm of its own fear. The aldermen met in their timbered hall, with wool cloaks steaming from the rain, and faces arranged into careful neutrality, the kind people put on when they plan to approve something, and then bury it in rules. Candles guttered in iron brackets. Beeswax clung to the air like a polite guest who will not leave. Outside, the bell on the harbour crane rang 3 thin notes as sailors hauled a crate of salt fish. Inside, the city weighed a man behind a mask against an illness with no face at all. They did not summon him. They did not want that beak in their chamber, or the way silence followed it. Instead, they summoned the scribe, the thin man, with ink for blood and patience like wet rope that did not break, but did stretch. He was given a folded decree, a purse with the weight of coin, and a set of instructions spoken as if they were an apology. He would follow the doctor at a distance. He would record every visit, every remedy, every person who improved and every person who did not. He would bring the council certainty, or at least the shape of it. Mainstream historical fact, tucked into the flow like a pin in a sleeve. Many cities during plague years hired doctors on salary and set them to rounds, binding them with ordinances about visitation, reporting and burial practices. Venice would later formalize entire magistracies of health. Ragusa would make quarantine an art by the close of the century. Our port was not so grand, but it had a taste for ledgers, and ledgers were the first step in every bureaucracy, including the improvised one called staying alive. So the council permitted the masked doctor to work. The permission was not public, and it came wrapped in string. He was to avoid crowds, to keep to numbered districts, to pass his patient names to the clerk by dusk each day. He was to accept payment only from the council chest, not from grateful relatives who might bankrupt themselves for a few days of hope. The beak was to remain, because even fear appreciates a symbol when it can be pointed at. The scribe began his shadowing at once. His shoes made little sound. His pen scratched like a polite mouse when he ducked into a doorway to jot a time and street name. He recorded the smell of the herbs, the tone of the doctor's gestures, the way a patient's breathing steadied under the juniper haze. He noted wind off the river that day, sour with mud. He noted which staircases creaked and which did not, purely because the mind needs something to anchor facts that wish to float away. He watched the doctor enter a weaver's cottage where 2 children lay with cheeks like hot apples and a mother whose hands had forgotten what to do when they were not wringing themselves. He saw the brazier set, the infused strip arranged, the careful drainage, the vinegar bowls refreshed, the small vial raised only once and then tucked away like a star into cloud. He wrote all of it down not as a believer and not as a skeptic, but as a man who knew that pages could outlast courage. Quirky tidbit to amuse a sleepless brain while we watch him write. One alderman kept on the council table a dried seahorse as a talisman against pestilence, pinched upright in a silver clip. He swore it turned its head when certain petitions were read, and only those. On the day the scribe received his orders, the little creature faced the window, and would not be coaxed to another angle. Superstition, yes, but in a season when even sensible bakers had begun to hang onion garlands in their ovens for protection, superstition had the floor more often than not. The decree required the scribe to try the remedies on paper before anyone tried them in politics. He collected smells and steps like recipes. He traced the path of the phrase that had begun to snowflake across the city, and he made a mark each time it appeared in the mouth of someone the doctor had never touched. Historians still argue whether this was truly a linguistic contagion or simply the mind's habit of catching rhythm and passing it along. The scribe, careful man, left the question open and added a column for context, said while folding linen, said while lifting a cask, said while counting change, said with no apparent reason at all. He delivered his first week's account to the council clerk in a packet warm from his body. The clerk sniffed at it like a dog at a new boot and passed it along to the alderman. They read with the impatience of men who want a verdict and are handed a symphony. Here were pulse counts and weather notations and cask numbers on Rope Maker's Lane. Here were names of the recovered, a list long enough to feel like audacity. Here were 3 deaths, set down with gentleness in the curve of the pen, because even ink can be kind. The council sat with this, and practiced that delicate art, civic anxiety disguised as prudence. They would not endorse the doctor in public, because endorsement can become blame when the wind changes. They would not ban him, because a ban would empty their own benches faster. So they did what councils do when a ship rides a storm too close to shore. They watched. They sent the scribe back out with an extra candle stub, and the polite suggestion that he might wish to sleep less. The masked doctor noticed the shadow, because of course he did. He noted it the way a hunter notes a deer fly, and does not swat because the work is more important than the itch. He let the scribe close enough to see the angle of his hands and no closer. He never looked back. He never changed his route to shake the tail. He simply added a second line of notes to his own book, a narrow column that seemed to count not time but attention. At day's end he left his patient list at the clerk's rail, a roll of names without flourish, and walked away before gratitude could gather. In the streets people adjusted. A few hawkers began calling their wares at a lower volume when the beak passed by, as if quiet could soften fear the way straw softens a fall. Children learned to mimic the long, proud mask with their hands, and then ran from their own shadows, laughing until they stumbled. A guild of carpenters offered, through the scribe, to build a better screen for street procedures, as if a finer curtain could civilize the business of cutting into flesh. The doctor accepted the screen and took no credit when it made onlookers stand a pace farther off. Another mainstream truth floated to the surface that week, a small fact with big consequences. Burial practices tightened as they did in many cities under pressure, with carts scheduled, pits managed, and a new rule that graves must be lime-lined when possible. The doctor did not attend burials. He sent notes about them with his patient lists, a line of dignity for the dead and a line of accountability for the living. In his quarters, the scribe practiced the phrase against his teeth and stopped himself like a man waking at the edge of a roof. He wrote, instead, about the rosemary in the cage by the doctor's window, which he had seen when the shutter gaped for a wink of wind. He wondered if the sprig looked fresher on certain days. He wondered if the doctor replaced it according to moon or mood. He wondered if it mattered at all, or if the mind was simply starving for patterns like a winter bird for crumbs. Council life continued with its usual perfumed dread. A delegation from the fishmongers petitioned for tax relief, and was gently told that relief had been given last month, which everyone in the room knew and no one wished to feel again. A mason complained about the lime shortage. A clerk coughed in the wrong part of the meeting and had to spend the rest of the hour pretending that coughing did not exist. Through it all, the decree sat in its drawer, smelling faintly of oil, and the scribe added pages to the stack that smelled faintly of the river. The permission had been granted. The watching had been arranged. The city, reluctantly allied with the man in the mask, made a bargain with pragmatism it could not admit in public. And beyond the chamber, behind shutter and sailcloth, the patients who woke after near drowning kept waking with the same strange syllables on their tongues, as if their lungs wanted to thank something older than the council, and were mispronouncing it in the only way they knew. At the end of that week, a new carriage rolled into the square, under embroidered pennants that claimed taste in a time without appetite. A household steward stepped down with care, eyes scanning for the mask that had become a minor constellation around which the days now moved. The scribe, who had begun to feel the city's nervous system twitch before the body did, closed his book without writing what he already understood. The reluctant alliance was about to be tested by a kind of request that never arrives as a request at all. The carriage was lacquered deep green, the colour of pine in winter rain, with brass fittings polished until they reflected the square's crooked rooftops. Its wheels were clean, too clean for streets that had been nothing but mud and refuse for weeks, meaning it had not travelled far through the city. The driver sat stiff as a figure carved for a ship's prow, reins held in a way that promised the horses would not so much as sniff at an unfamiliar curb. From the step descended a man in the livery of one of the wealthiest merchant houses, the kind whose cargo manifests were copied into 3 ledgers and locked in 3 different chests. His boots were black as oil, his gloves butter soft, and his expression carried that cultivated disinterest of someone who has been trained since birth to think in terms of accounts rather than minutes. The scribe watched from the lee of a baker's awning as the steward moved through the square, scanning faces, ignoring the murmurs. When the masked doctor emerged from a side street, the steward's posture shifted, as though a hawk had just sighted its prey. He approached, nodded once, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement of identification, and handed over a folded letter sealed in green wax. The wax bore the mark of a sea serpent coiled around a scale, the emblem of Aldous Renzani, a merchant whose ships owned more of the dock than the council would ever admit. Renzani had survived 3 shipping crises, 2 wars over tariffs, and 1 assassination attempt in the spice markets. Now his wife lay sick, and not with the plague, or so the steward claimed, but with a fever that no apothecary draught could tame. Mainstream historical fact, in times of epidemic, the wealthy often secured private physicians and guarded them jealously, sometimes secluding both doctor and patient to keep their households sealed from contagion. Patronage could make a healer untouchable in some cities, a dangerous commodity in others. Here, a patron like Renzani meant immunity from most petty restrictions, but also an audience of the most dangerous kind. The doctor accepted the letter without bowing, broke the seal, read it once, and tucked it into his satchel. His mask turned fractionally toward the steward, who responded with the smallest of inclinations, as if to say the carriage was waiting. Without a word to the scribe, who was dutifully pretending to study the price of onions, he stepped into the carriage and vanished behind the green-painted door. The ride to the merchant's quarter was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Cobbled streets gave way to wider lanes lined with plane trees, their bark peeling in flakes that littered the gutter like curled scraps of parchment. The Renzani house stood behind a high wall topped with wrought iron that coiled like vines, the gate guarded by 2 men whose armor was more decorative than functional. Inside, the air shifted. No dock stench here, no tannery reek, just beeswax, citrus oil, and the faint perfume of dried lavender tucked into corners. The steward led him through a hall paved in tiles, imported from somewhere warmer, each one painted with geometric patterns that seemed to shift as he walked. Servants moved silently along the walls, their eyes fixed on the floor. In a shuttered chamber upstairs, the merchant's wife lay pale against a mound of pillows, her hair braided and coiled like the ropes on her husband's ships. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her cheeks flushed with a fever's stubborn bloom. 2 apothecaries hovered nearby, their expressions a delicate balance between insult and relief at the arrival of this new, uninvited colleague. The doctor set his satchel on a low table, opened it, and began laying out his instruments without preamble. The apothecaries stiffened at the sight of the infused cloth strips, their glistening faintness catching the lamplight. The merchant himself, standing at the foot of the bed in a robe lined with sable, watched without speaking, his gaze as cool and weighing as any balance scale. Quirky tidbit: wealthy households sometimes kept a plague room, stocked with certain protective charms, sprigs of rue bound with red thread, bowls of vinegar, with floating rosemary, even small cages of songbirds thought to warn of bad air by ceasing to sing. In this chamber there was a gilded cage against the far wall, empty but for a ribbon of silk knotted to the perch. Whether the bird had died or been released, no one said. The doctor examined the merchant's wife as he had examined the dock worker, precise, methodical, recording the same moon phase and wind direction in his small book. The fever was not of the same breed as the plague, but it clung to her with the same jealous tenacity. He placed a brazier near the bed, fed it with juniper, and set one of his cloth strips over her mouth and nose. Then from the satchel he drew the straw-coloured vial. The apothecaries exchanged a glance that hovered between curiosity and suspicion. The merchant raised a hand, not to stop, but to indicate that he understood this moment to be one where power shifted in the room. The doctor tilted a few drops between the woman's lips, waited, and then repeated the motion. Her breathing slowed. The flush at her cheeks softened to something less angry. Historians still argue whether the merchant's wife's recovery was swift or gradual. Accounts differ, perhaps depending on how much the storyteller wished to attribute to the doctor's skill. What all versions agree on is that she woke before dawn the next day, asked for cool water, and spoke a few words to her husband in a voice steadied by rest. And among those words, according to the maid who carried the basin, was the phrase. The maid didn't recognize it, but she remembered the sound well enough to repeat it to another servant, who repeated it to a cousin, and by the week's end it had slipped out through the gates and into the city again. This time, however, it came gilded with the whisper that the merchant himself had heard it and not rebuked it. In a place where gossip was currency, that made it spend faster. The scribe, when the doctor emerged from the merchant's carriage the next afternoon, noted that his satchel looked lighter. He also noted that the doctor walked straight past the clerk's desk without delivering his usual list of patients. Whether this was oversight or intent, the scribe could not tell, but he marked it in his journal all the same, under the heading Renzani. That night, the merchant sent a crate of Sicilian lemons to the cooper's workshop, along with a note in a hand too ornate to be his own. The doctor burned the note unread and set the lemons in the alley for the neighbours. By morning, only the crate remained, smelling faintly of salt and something sharper. The bells of St. Anselm tolled high in the wind, their bronze voices rolling over the rooftops like surf. In the poorer quarter, mothers crossed themselves at the sound. In the merchant quarter, servants paused only long enough to count the chimes before returning to work. And in the shadow of the cathedral itself, a figure in the black robes of a confessor walked with purpose, his leather satchel slapping against his hip at each step. The man was Father Matteo, sent by the bishop under a polite pretext to offer confession to the sick and comfort to the dying. His true orders, delivered in a side chapel with only the bishop's secretary as witness, were to speak with the masked doctor and decide whether his methods served God or something less welcome. The bishop's phrasing had been careful, the way one phrases a question when the answer might require fire. Father Matteo was no stranger to plague work. He had walked the death carts in Venice, and heard last confessions in narrow rooms thick with the smell of rosemary and sweat. He knew the ordinary rhythms of illness, and the ordinary failings of healers who promised too much, but he had never met a man who left in his wake a trail of cured souls murmuring the same alien syllables. Mainstream historical fact: during plague years, the Church's role extended beyond burial rites to moral oversight of healers, sometimes granting or withholding permission to practice based on orthodoxy as much as skill. Inquisitors were rare in port cities, but confessors with sharp eyes were common, tasked with ensuring no superstitious or pagan practices undermined the faithful. The priest found the doctor in a narrow lane behind the tanner's yard, tending to a carter whose skin was blotched, but whose breathing had not yet turned ragged. The beak of the mask tilted toward the sound of boots on cobbles before Father Matteo even spoke. He announced himself not as an accuser, but as a man in need of counsel, an old trick for softening resistance, and gestured toward the satchel. The doctor said nothing, only shifted his weight to finish binding the infused cloth strip around the carter's face. The smoke of juniper and something sharper curled in the cold air, drifting toward the priest, who recognized the scent of frankincense buried deep in the mix. He frowned. Frankincense was expensive here, more common in altar censers than street cures. Quirky tidbit: in some plague-struck towns, parish priests would burn frankincense in the streets during processions, believing the sweet smoke would purify the air. In others, it was reserved strictly for liturgical use, the scent becoming an unofficial badge of the Church's authority. To smell it here, mingled with vinegar and pine, was unsettling, like finding a psalm rewritten for the marketplace. Father Matteo asked the doctor where he had learned his art. The beak inclined slightly toward him, but no words came. Instead, the doctor tapped the side of his own mask, then pointed to the sky, then to the carter's chest as it rose and fell more evenly under the smoke. It was as close to an answer as the priest would get. Watch, not question. Historians still argue whether Matteo's next move was calculated or genuine. He removed his gloves, knelt beside the patient, and began to recite a short prayer in Latin, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. The doctor did not interrupt, but his gaze, hidden though it was, felt fixed on the priest's lips. When Matteo reached the final Amen, the carter murmured something in reply. Not Latin, not the local dialect, the phrase. The priest's hand tightened on the man's shoulder. He asked him to repeat it. The carter blinked, confused, and claimed he had only said, "Thank you." Matteo pressed. What language? Where had he heard it? But the man only shook his head. The doctor packed his satchel in silence, set a small coin in the carter's palm, and began to walk away. Matteo followed, down 2 lanes, past the cooper's yard, across a market square where the winter sun limped between clouds. Finally he called out, not in rebuke but in the tone of a man offering confession. He asked the doctor if he feared for his soul. The doctor stopped, turned just enough for the mask's black glass eyes to catch the light, and then resumed walking. The priest returned to the cathedral that evening and wrote a report that was more questions than answers. He noted the efficacy of the cures, the consistency of the strange phrase among survivors, and the presence of frankincense in non-liturgical settings. He did not accuse the doctor of heresy. Doing so without proof would invite mockery from the council, but he did underline the need for continued spiritual observation. The bishop, after reading it twice, sent a polite request to the council for more information on their arrangement with the masked healer. The scribe, who saw Matteo leave the doctor's side in the market, noted the exchange in his own journal, adding that the doctor's pace had quickened afterward, as though evading something unseen. He also noted that 2 more cured patients had been heard speaking the phrase at the fountain near the north gate, one while drawing water, the other while shooing pigeons from the steps. In the weeks to come, Father Matteo would make a point of being present at some of the doctor's visits, always with a word of comfort for the sick and an ear tuned for the phrase. He began to suspect it was not taught deliberately, but passed like a yawn from one to another. Whether it was a blessing, a symptom, or something else entirely, he could not say, but he did begin keeping a tally of how often he caught himself mouthing it while alone in the cloister. The church had not yet moved against the doctor, but the scent of scrutiny now followed him as surely as the scent of rosemary and smoke. And in a city where scent was often the first sign of trouble, that meant more eyes were turning his way, even the ones that usually preferred to stay shut. The city's nights had a way of sounding hollow, as though the darkness were a bell and every distant footstep a clapper. On such a night, with the tide turning and the moon shaved thin as a baker's thumbnail, a skiff slid along the quay without so much as a courtesy splash. The oars moved like quiet thoughts. No lantern swung from its stem, which in a town of harbour rules was less a misdemeanour than a philosophy. The scribe had learnt the doctor's insomnia by now, had matched his own heartbeat to the other man's schedule so often that sleep felt like an optional civic duty. He waited beneath the cooper's eaves, where the drip from the gutter kept time, watching the shutter above for the faintest slit of lamplight. It came, a thread of amber drawn across wood, then fading as though the room had blinked. The beaked silhouette passed once, twice, then stilled. The skiff kissed the quay. 2 figures stood. One was young, bareheaded despite the cold, a rope looped around his shoulder. The other wore the brown habit of a lay brother, hood up, the hem stiff with salt, no flourish, no calling out. They hefted 3 bundles from the boat, oblong parcels wrapped in oilcloth and bound with waxed cord, each bearing a seal pressed into a disk of dark resin. When the lay brother set them down, the resin caught the moon and showed its face, a cross within a wheel surrounded by tiny sprigs, the emblem of a monastery far along the coast, where the wind learned to chant before the men did. Mainstream historical fact: monasteries of the High Middle Ages were hubs of medicine, as much as prayer, tending physic gardens of sage, rue, fennel, and dozens of other plants, copying herbals, and storing resins and imported aromatics in tidy rooms that smelled like saints and sap. Monks travelled under letters of passage, trading cuttings and seeds the way merchants traded wool and dye. In plague years, those networks ran hot and quiet, slipping remedies between ports like contraband hope. The door below the cooper's stair opened just wide enough for a shadow to flow out. The doctor crossed the alley with that same not quite human stillness, the mask turning the modest errand into a visitation. No words, a gloved hand extended, a sealed packet exchanged hands, not large enough to be coin, too heavy for parchment alone. The lay brother pressed 2 fingers to the seal of the top bundle, as if to bless or warn it, then returned to the skiff. The young oarsman stared at the mask as sailors stare at a sudden squall, equal parts awe and calculation, then pushed off. The boat melted back into the channel where gulls slept with their beaks tucked under their madness. The scribe waited until the doctor was halfway up the stair, then drifted across the street, like a very motivated draft. He knelt at the wet mark the boat had left and touched the wheel and herb seal, stamped into the resin flake that had broken free. The impression was crisp enough to tally each leaf. He filed the emblem in his mind among things in need of cross-examination, which was getting crowded. Historians still argue whether he guessed the monastery correctly from that night's clue, or only joined the dots later, when dots began volunteering for duty. Upstairs, the room roused itself into lamplight and breath. The doctor cut the cords with a horn knife, set the oilcloth aside, and lifted the lids of shallow wooden trays. The first tray held paper-wrapped bundles tied with red thread, each labelled in that same narrow script the scribe could admire but never decipher. He teased a corner up with his penknife and found inside a felt of dried leaves grey as fog and twice as fragrant. Not local. The smell was bitter and clean, with a citrusy afterthought that nipped the nose and woke the mind like cold water. The second tray was more interesting, precisely because it looked less like medicine. Pale wafers stacked like communion bread, but dusted with something green. A cluster of small clay coins stamped with strange repeating figures. 2 thumb-length glass vials sealed with black pitch, the liquid inside barely moving, as though shy. A roll of linen so fine it could have been spider work, its edges sewn with a thread the colour of old wine. The scribe recognized nothing and resented the sensation in a professional way. He watched the doctor handle each piece with that impassive thrift of motion. 1 wafer was lifted to the nose, considered, filed into a jar. 1 clay coin went into a brazier's ash, where it hissed as if releasing a very long-held breath, then perfumed the room with a resinous sweetness that sat the scribe back on his heels. He thought of processions and incense and a confessor's steady hand at a deathbed. He thought, with a squint of humour he did not write down, that the church might wish to invoice the doctor for mood. The third tray carried the kind of surprise that skirts the edges of propriety. Not organs. Those belonged to another day's curiosity, but things that had once been nearer the sea than any human, things folded from distant shores into smelling salts of their own. Strips of kelp cured to velvet, a small sack of powdered shells no 2 grains alike, a piece of something black and glossy, curved like a shard of a tear. The doctor held that last fragment carefully, touched it to a drop of vinegar on a plate, watched the meniscus shiver, wrote a symbol in his book, then put the shard somewhere private the scribe could not see. Quirky tidbit to slide between trays. Some monastic herbals recommend snail syrups for chest ailments, a patient sweetness brewed from creatures that carry their houses and their cures in the same spiral. In a corner of the second tray nestled a small vial of pale paste, the consistency of mercy, and the scribe, adventurous but not reckless, decided to take the monk's word that he did not need to learn that particular recipe firsthand. No one knocked. The city made its own privacy when the hour went blue like that. Still, the scribe caught himself listening for footsteps that did not belong to chance. He thought of Father Matteo's report and the way the bishop had underlined spiritual observation until the ink tore the parchment. He thought too of the council's decree and its long tail of obligations. If the doctor was importing knowledge, he was also importing politics disguised as bundles. The doctor moved through his routine, faster now that his hands held familiar strangers. He ground, he dissolved, He trailed narrow lines of liquid from vial to cup, as if drawing constellations only he could see. He set aside 3 infused strips to dry under the bell jar, one darker than the others, its scent tugging at memory like a half-heard hymn. He opened his window a slit and replaced the rosemary in the cage. It perked as if remembering itself. Some plants obeyed rules the rest of the world had forgotten. The scribe catalogued the scene with a scholar's greed. He traced the monastery's seal into his journal, and beneath it copied a line he'd read years before in a borrowed herbal about the gardens of monks, beds, edged with boxwood, water channels, straight as psalms, medicinal plants, trained to thrive where prayer taught discipline. He jotted another note about trade routes for frankincense and myrrh, resins that turned up wherever the church turned its face. Historians still argue whether this clandestine supply represented a brotherhood of healers acting beyond episcopal patience, or simply the more ordinary commerce of monasteries that knew their worth in a season when worth was counted in breaths. The bundles exhausted, the room settled. The doctor doused the lamp, let the brazier keep the air breathing, and sat back in his chair mask, that unnatural roost he favoured over beds and other human admissions. Below, the tide nuzzled the quay in its sleep, and the skiff was already a rumour in the fog. Outside the window, the scribe whispered the strange phrase against the glass, and watched it fog with his breath. The syllables fit together like boards planed for the same chest. He wiped the pane with his sleeve, half expecting the word to leave a stain. It did not, of course. Reality maintains some dignity even on nights like these. He closed his journal with care, lit the resin flake into his pocket for later inquiry, and vanished down the stair as the first gull practiced grief on the morning. He did not report the bundles to the council yet, not out of mercy or fear, but out of a collector's superstition that one more piece would make the puzzle admit its picture. For now, 3 trays lay empty on the table inside, their scents braided with the room's other secrets, and somewhere up the coast, a bell in a walled garden tolled for matins while hands in brown habits pressed new seals for the next tide. It began as a whisper in the records, not the air. The scribe, with his tidy columns and quick pen, had started mapping the phrase as though it were a trade route, dots for where it was spoken, lines for how it travelled, small notations for whether the speaker had ever met the masked doctor. At first, the pattern looked like a drunken spider's web, the kind a broom can undo, but by the second month, the web had taken shape, reaching far past the city's gates, in threads too straight to be chance. He wasn't the only one to notice. The Fishmongers' Guild complained to the council that sailors were bringing dock talk from other ports, words that made the hairs rise on the neck, passed over barrels and into the mouths of men who should be counting herring. A caravan master, newly returned from inland, swore that a stable boy in a town 3 days' ride away had muttered the same syllables while checking a mule's hooves, despite never having left his own street. Mainstream historical fact in medieval Europe, phrases and songs often travelled faster than their supposed originators. A merchant's tune could be whistled in 3 markets by week's end. A pilgrim's prayer might be in the mouth of someone 100 miles away before the month was out. But such things usually bent the shape of local language. This phrase did not bend. It stayed exactly the same, each syllable hard-edged, each vowel held for a fraction too long. The scribe's journal began to look less like a record and more like a contagion map, with the phrase as the infection, docks, markets, taverns, then farmsteads on the road to the capital. Always the same 3 or 4 syllables, spoken without awareness, without explanation. Quirky tidbit: a potter in the East Market claimed that after saying the phrase in his sleep, he woke to find a vase on his wheel perfectly symmetrical for the first time in his life. He kept it on his stall as proof, though anyone who touched it swore it was oddly warm, even on cold days. Whether coincidence or craft, the story drew customers who wanted to hear the potter mutter in his dreams. Historians still argue whether the phrase's spread was fueled by fascination, fear, or some other mechanism entirely. Some propose it was a kind of mnemonic seed, carried in the mind's soil until conditions were right. Others dismiss it as a medieval game of pass the nonsense, inflated by the coincidence of timing with the doctor's successes. The council, for their part, began receiving reports from nearby towns, asking, politely, at first whether a certain masked healer was in their employ, and whether his methods involved verbal charms. The aldermen, caught between denying involvement and claiming credit, chose their usual middle ground. They said nothing in writing. The scribe was quietly instructed to stop drawing maps and start writing isolated incidents in the margin instead. But reality did not follow the minutes of council meetings. A merchant's son, travelling upriver to deliver a chest of coins, returned speaking the phrase whenever he counted anything: steps, coins, sheep on the hillsides. A guild mistress in the weaver's quarter began humming it under her breath while working the loom, the rhythm slipping into the warp and weft of her cloth. A stevedore swore he saw the word scratched into the hull of a ship newly arrived from the south, though it was gone by morning. The scribe tried to keep his professional remove, but the more he recorded, the more he caught himself saying it while dipping his pen or while scraping candle wax from his desk. Once, in the middle of writing the phrase for reference, his hand kept going, producing a string of symbols he didn't recognize. In a script that looked nothing like his own, he tore that page out and burned it in the brazier, telling himself it was simply a lapse brought on by fatigue. Meanwhile, the doctor's rounds continued. He took no public notice of the phrase's spread. His patients, cured and uncured, received the same care, the same strips, the same smoke. The scribe shadowed him to a tanner's shop, where the owner's eldest had fallen ill, and heard the boy murmur the syllables after his first clear breath in days. The doctor paused, not in surprise, but in something closer to confirmation before returning to his work. By now, traders on the road into the city sometimes arrived already knowing the word. They'd say it in greeting, laughing at its oddity, as if sharing a harmless joke picked up along the way. But others spoke it in quieter tones, as though it carried weight. A mason, overheard at an alehouse, claimed his grandmother had taught it to him as a child, to keep the fever away, though she had died years before the plague arrived. The council began to worry about optics. Though they didn't use that word, they feared anything that blurred the line between medicine and magic, especially when the church's confessor was already making notes about incense and incantations. Rumors that the phrase could ward off sickness or bring it were the kind of thing that could spark unrest in a population that was already sleep-deprived and half-starved. One evening, as autumn began its slow tightening, the scribe returned to his quarters to find a scrap of parchment under his door. It bore only the phrase, written in his own hand, though he had not written it. He searched the room for signs of intrusion, and found none. The ink was fresh, the edges of the parchment still curling from the cut. He burned it without thinking, but the smell of the smoke was wrong, sharper, greener, like crushed herbs. He went to the cooper's workshop the next day, but the doctor was gone. A neighbor said he'd left before dawn, heading west with his satchel. The scribe followed, keeping to the shadows, until the city walls fell behind them, and the road curved toward villages that had yet to see the mask in their streets. At the first crossroads, the scribe heard a farmer greeting a passing cart driver, not with good day, but with the phrase. The cart driver answered in kind. Neither looked surprised. By nightfall, the scribe's map of the phrase was useless. The web had outgrown its weaver, and somewhere in the dark ahead, the doctor kept walking. The beak pointed toward places where the word had already arrived without him. The first sign of the rival alchemist wasn't his arrival. It was the sound of his voice, carrying across the fish market like a brass kettle rolling down stone steps. Even in a city where traders from half the world haggled daily, his accent was strange, vowels pitched high and clipped, consonants as sharp as oyster shells. He spoke in the rhythm of someone accustomed to drawing a crowd, and the crowd obliged. By the time the scribe reached the square, a ring of onlookers had already formed around a stall that hadn't been there yesterday. Its canopy was crimson, the cloth patterned with gold symbols that might have been stars or might have been the decorative flourishes of a man who wanted to suggest mystery without explaining it. Beneath it stood a tall figure in a leather apron too clean to have seen any real work, sleeves rolled high to reveal forearms powdered with what he claimed was ground pearl. He introduced himself as Master Salvestro, an alchemist from the southern coast, trained under masters whose books you have only seen in the hands of bishops. He laid out his jars with the flair of a juggler, each one labelled in florid script: tinctures, unguents, elixirs. To the scribe's irritation, His audience leaned in at every word, some holding coins already. Mainstream historical fact: public demonstrations of medicine, especially during plague years, were common in markets. Surgeons pulled teeth on stools. Herbalists hawked remedies by curing a prearranged volunteer of a fake ailment. It was theatre as much as treatment, credibility measured in applause and silver. Salvestro's patter slid between practical advice and pure spectacle. He cracked a walnut and sprinkled powder into it before eating it whole. He rubbed an ointment into the skin of a boy's arm until a red rash faded. Likely paint, the scribe thought, but convincing from a distance. He even set a small brazier on the stall's edge and threw in a pinch of powder that made the smoke turn briefly blue, earning an appreciative murmur from the crowd. And then, as if by accident, he mentioned the masked doctor. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he said, holding up a jar of bright yellow liquid, the one with the beak. "He does good work, I hear, but his remedies are selective." The crowd chuckled uneasily. Salvestro smiled like a cat, spotting a slow bird. "I, on the other hand, will share my cures with anyone, plague or no plague. No secrecy, no strange words whispered in the night." The scribe felt the crowd shift, the way an audience shifts when given permission to doubt what they've admired. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval cities, rivals in the healing trade would engage in remedy duels, each treating a patient with the same ailment under public observation, the outcome settled by survival or recovery time. These duels drew wagers, songs, and occasional riots. The council, wary of unrest, usually banned them unless they saw an opportunity for revenue. Historians still argue whether Salvestro challenged the doctor outright or merely let the idea drift until the crowd demanded it. Either way, the outcome was the same. By the week's end, a demonstration was arranged in the square, with the council's quiet blessing and the scribe tasked to record the proceedings. 2 patients, both fevered, both willing to be volunteers in exchange for food and coin, would be treated, one by each man. The crowd would watch. The council would judge. On the appointed day, the air itself seemed to lean toward the square. Merchants closed early, apprentices climbed onto barrels for a better view, and even the church bells delayed the noon chime. Salvestro arrived first, his crimson canopy already raised, jars arranged like jewels. He bowed to the alderman, then to the crowd, as if the two were interchangeable. The masked doctor came next, walking in that steady, unhurried way that ignored spectacle. He carried no canopy, no display table, just his satchel, the brazier, and a bundle of infused strips. The crowd's noise dipped when he appeared, as though someone had closed a door. The 2 patients were seated on stools in the center. Salvestro went first, washing his patient's face with rosewater and applying a paste that smelled sweet enough to eat. He narrated every step, tossing in half-truths about humors and celestial alignments, making sure each jar caught the sun. His patient, though still feverish, smiled faintly at the attention. Then it was the doctor's turn. He did not speak. He set the brazier between himself and his patient, fed it juniper, and let the smoke curl upward. He tied the infused strip over the man's mouth and nose, checked the pulse, and poured a few drops from the straw-colored vial. His hands moved with the precision of habit, ignoring the murmurs when the scent of frankincense threaded through the air. The scribe recorded it all: Salvestro's rolling commentary, the doctor's silence, the way the 2 patients swayed differently on their stools by the end. Salvestro's man looked alert, even cheerful, but his cheeks still burned with fever. The doctor's patient was quiet, breathing evenly, a faint color returning under the skin. No verdict was given that day. The council claimed they would observe both patients over the next week before declaring a winner. But the crowd had its own verdict, whispered in the taverns that night. The Beaks man had worked faster, surer, without show. And yet, Salvestro's jibe about strange words had stuck. By the following market day, the phrase was on more tongues than ever, and this time the scribe noticed something unsettling. A boy who had been treated by Salvestro was saying it too. The scribe kept his journals as a miser keeps coin, counted nightly, stacked neatly, hidden where a thief would need a map and a monk's patience. He used a narrow cupboard built into the wall behind his bed, its latch disguised as a knot in the wood. Inside, every notebook wore a strip of dyed thread stitched to the spine, a private index he could read with fingertips in the dark, When he lifted the mattress, the bed groaned its familiar protest. The cupboard creaked its familiar answer, and the city outside whispered itself to sleep. Routine could be a lullaby even in a season that preferred dirges. He slept poorly and woke with work already crawling into his skull. Dawn handled the window like old linen, thin and easily torn. He rolled from the bed, shoved the trunk with his toe, and reached for the cupboard latch, without looking, the way the hand learns the exact height of the picture you use every day. The knot yielded. The door opened. Inside, the tidy ranks of notebooks were gone. For a heartbeat, he thought he had chosen the wrong morning and the wrong world. He dragged the cupboard door fully open and found only a single page laid flat where a dozen volumes should have been. The parchment was heavier than his usual purchase, a better grade with a faint tooth to it, as if it had been cut from a folio too proud to bend. Written across it from top to bottom, margin to margin, in his own hand with his own ink, was the phrase, not once, hundreds of times. The same 3 or 4 syllables chained like men on a road, each line ending mid-breath and beginning again without apology. The angle of the letters was his, the tilt of the stems his, even the small habit of lifting the pen at the same point and dotting the page with a faint brown mist. He flipped the sheet over and the words continued, tighter, as if conserving space for a deadline no one had mentioned. The page smelled faintly of crushed rosemary. He did the sensible things in the wrong order. He checked the window latch, which was closed. He checked the door, which had the good manners to stay bolted. He checked the floorboards for pried nails, the bed frame for tampering, the trunk for missing silver he never kept. Everything was exactly where the world had left it, except for the books that mattered more than coin and were suddenly as absent as moderation in a tavern. Mainstream historical fact, for those who like a touchstone while the floor tilts. Civic records during plague years often suffered gaps. Fire, flood, rats, and panicked relocation ruined ledgers daily. Scribes learned to keep duplicates if they could, and to store sealed copies in guild chests or sacristies with thick doors. Paperwork has always considered itself a fragile species. He did have one duplicate, of a sort, a small index of names and page references stitched to his belt under his tunic. He pulled it free with numb fingers, opened it to the first page, and found that the tiny entries had been carefully inked over with the same phrase in a line, so fine it took his breath to see it. Every name suffocated beneath the syllables like seeds paved under a road. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of the scribe's ledger was an act of malice by rivals, an inside job by twitchy aldermen eager to erase their own complicity, the meddling of monastic hands that preferred silence to scandal, or something more unnerving to a rational mind. The cupboard had no pry marks. The window showed no scrape where a climber's boot would have chewed wood. The bed's dust was undisturbed but for his own heel prints from the night before. The room smelled not of intruders but of his own life, layered lamp oil, vellum, and the after scent of herbs that had begun to haunt his clothes without his consent. He took the page and folded it into a square, then unfolded it, then folded it again, as if he could change its contents with geometry. He set it to the lamp and watched the light find the fibers like map lines. For 3 heartbeats he thought of burning it. Then he thought of the council clerk, who would need to see the absence written down, and Father Matteo, who would need to smell the rosemary in order to arrange his face into the right configuration of concern. He slid the square into his sleeve and left the room without breakfast. At the clerk's desk he presented the empty cupboard with an economy of words usually reserved for arrests. The clerk frowned into the space where the books should have been, as if his stare might call them back. He asked predictable questions without moving his lips from their disapproving position. He tapped his pen against nothing, then against the desk, then against the air, then wrote a receipt for loss, as if a receipt could soothe theft. The alderman received the news with the dignity of men who have never lost anything that could not be replaced by coin. They arranged their expressions into a polite row and agreed it must be the work of a market thief with very particular tastes. The scribe, who knew the market's thieves as neighbours know each other's coughs, kept his tongue flat in his mouth and did not bite it. The council ordered him to reconstruct the records from memory and helpfully provided a stack of fresh paper. The dried seahorse on the table returned to facing the window. Outside, Salvestro the rival alchemist was recounting. to anyone who would share a morning loaf, an amusing tale of bureaucratic misfortune. He waved his clean hands and asked how a city could lose its own notes. He called it an accident of ink. He offered to sell the council a system of locked chests and branded seals that would guarantee no such loss again. The scribe, listening from the shade of the fishmonger's stall, wrote in his mind that Salvestro's canopy today showed a new pattern along the hem, a repeating wheel circled by sprigs, and filed that image in the part of his mind that collected unhelpful coincidences. He went to Father Matteo next. The confessor's candle lit the stone like a small moon and turned the scribe's face into hard angles. Matteo listened without interruption, then asked to see the folded page. He held it to the light, frowned at the scent, and touched the edge to his tongue on instinct, as if testing for sacramental residue. He tasted nothing but old paper and new worry. Quirky tidbit to keep for the margins. Some monks practiced a sport of memory in which they placed imagined objects in imagined rooms of an imagined house, then strolled the halls to retrieve them for recitation. The scribe, who had once watched a Dominican catalogue an entire chapter by walking the nave with his eyes closed, began building such a house in his head on the walk home. He put the dockworker's name on the lintel of a doorway that smelled of juniper. He laid the merchant's wife on a high bed draped in green curtains. He hung Father Matteo's frown like a shield where the aisle met the transept. He hoped the mind could be a better cupboard than wood. The masked doctor received the news as he received everything, without flinch. The scribe found him in a courtyard off Ropemaker's Lane, rinsing his gloves in a basin of vinegar while a cured child chased a hoop into the sunlight, and looked shocked to find the day still there. The scribe told him about the cupboard and the page. The doctor lifted his head a fraction, the glass eyes indifferent to shock. He reached into his satchel, drew out his narrow leather book, and opened to a page near the center. What the scribe saw there did not comfort him. The neat lines of moon phases and winds were joined by a column of names that matched his own list so closely. He felt a momentary disorientation, the way you feel when you see your reflection move out of time with you. But where his own entries would have listed street, symptom, outcome, the doctor's bore symbols the scribe could not read, small repeating figures like bricks that build a wall before your eyes. He pointed at the column, a small breach of his usual neutrality. The doctor closed the book, not rudely but with finality, and slipped it back into the satchel. Then he placed his gloved hand over the scribe's sleeve where the folded page rested, and left it there for a slow count of 3, as if to say that some losses are instructions, not accidents. By evening, copies of the phrase had appeared in 3 places where the scribe did not expect them, chiseled shallow into the wet lime of a new wall by the north gate, scratched into the underside of the council bench where idle boots had polished the wood for years, inked in faint strokes along the edge of a market tally that a fishmonger swore he had not written. The word was turning up like salt, inevitable and unbidden. He began the reconstruction that night, building a ledger out of memory and stubbornness. He wrote the first name and the second without incident, the third with a pause for breath. On the 10th, his hands slowed and drifted. He set the pen down and covered it with his palm as if calming a sparrow. He stood, paced once, returned and wrote again. On the 30th, his ink slid sideways into the shape he feared. He tore that scrap free, folded it, placed it atop the other folded square from the cupboard, and tied both with red thread. Historians still argue whether what erased the ledger was human and frightened or inhuman, and oddly meticulous. They argue too whether the city would have behaved differently had those books survived, had the names remained names instead of syllables, drowned in a word that did not belong to them. The scribe stopped arguing with himself and started copying by candlelight, the rosemary in his room refusing to wilt as quickly as it should have, as if taking instructions from a cage it had never seen. The pages multiplied under his pen. So did the whispers in the street. Somewhere in the warehouse quarter, a clerk trailed his finger along the grain of a crate and found the phrase rising under his touch, as if from the wood itself. Somewhere in the cathedral, a choirboy caught himself humming it between verses and bit his lip red to stop. Somewhere in a room with a hidden cupboard, a new ledger began that would not be hidden and would not be easily erased, written into people rather than parchment, which has always been the more durable medium. By midwinter, the plague's grip on the city had loosened enough for people to remember how to grumble about things other than survival. The bakers complained about grain prices. The tanners argued about taxes on hides. The dockmen muttered about the council's endless inspections. But tucked in between these ordinary grievances was something far less ordinary, an unease about the masked doctor's cures. The unease didn't come from failure, quite the opposite. He was curing too many people. In a season when the death carts should still be creaking through the streets twice a day, they were now seen only once every few days. Graves were being dug at half the pace, and the lime pits near the river lay strangely still under their frost. The grave diggers muttered that they'd be out of work by spring, and the midwives, who sometimes doubled as layers out of the dead, found themselves idle. Mainstream historical fact: in plague years, a sudden drop in mortality often made the authorities suspicious rather than grateful. They feared that reported numbers were false, that the dead were being hidden, or that some unnatural influence was at work. Recovery en masse could be as politically destabilizing as mass death, especially if it was credited to a single man. The scribe heard the first hints of doubt in the guild halls. A brewer suggested that those who recovered under the doctor's care were not entirely the same people they had been before. A mason swore that one of his men, cured of the sickness, could now work from dawn until full dark without tiring, and that he didn't seem to notice the cold. A washerwoman claimed her neighbour's eyes had changed colour after she recovered, though no one else could confirm it. And then there was the matter of the phrase. By now, everyone knew it, even those who had never been ill. It had passed beyond the doctor's patience, carried by conversation, mimicry, and something less definable. Children chanted it in the alleys as part of a skipping game. Sailors carved it into the rails of their ships. Merchants muttered it while counting coin, the way a gambler taps the table for luck. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval towns, a saying or song tied to a specific event could end up woven into daily life for decades, its origin forgotten. A rhyme to ward off plague fleas might, in peacetime, become a nursery tune. Here, however, the phrase's origin was remembered all too clearly, and it unsettled people to hear it on the lips of those untouched by the doctor's hands. The council called a quiet session. The masked doctor was not invited. Neither was the scribe, though his reports were spread on the table like a feast no one intended to enjoy. The aldermen spoke in the measured tones of men who suspected the walls were listening. They noted the drop in plague deaths. They noted the spread of the phrase. They noted reluctantly that some of the cured seemed different, not in ways that could be written into law, but in ways that made their neighbours step back a pace. Historians still argue about this part, whether the differences were real or simply the city's imagination feeding on its own anxiety. Surviving council records use vague language, alterations of comportment, unexpected endurance, subtle alterations of voice, phrases that could mean almost anything or nothing at all. The scribe, hearing about the meeting afterward from the clerk, recognized the pattern. Fear was turning from the plague itself to the man who had beaten it back, and fear of a man could be acted upon. A week later, he followed the doctor to a workshop in the weaver's quarter. A young woman lay on a cot by the loom, her skin pale but her eyes sharp. She had been sick for 3 days. The doctor applied his usual measures: infused cloth, juniper smoke, a few drops from the straw-coloured vial, and within hours she was sitting up, asking for water. Her father, overjoyed, pressed the doctor to stay for supper. He refused, but lingered long enough to check her pulse again. The scribe noted that her breathing was steady, her colour returning. But he also noted something else. When her younger brother entered the room, she greeted him not with his name but with the phrase. She laughed, she said it, as though it were an old joke between them. The boy laughed too, and repeated it back. On the walk home, the scribe caught himself repeating the exchange in his mind, the syllables fitting together with a neatness that was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like design. By the month's end, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The cured were everywhere, back at their work, stronger than before, their appetites restored, their tempers steady even under insult. It should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, it was becoming a cause for suspicion. No one had ever seen recovery on this scale, nor with such uniform vigour. The grave diggers, idle and uneasy, began muttering that the city was being repopulated by something not entirely human. The midwives kept their thoughts quieter but started marking the doors of the cured with chalk, as if they were tracking a different kind of illness. The scribe, for all his habit of neat columns and tidy ink, could not keep his own mind in order. He dreamed of the phrase, not as a sound but as a structure, something built of air and intention, standing in the middle of a dark field. He would wake with the sense that he had been walking around it, tracing its shape, trying to find an entrance. When he told the doctor about the council's unease, the man gave no answer. He simply packed his satchel and moved on to his next patient. But the scribe noticed for the first time that the doctor's mask lenses were not entirely opaque. In the right light, you could glimpse the eyes behind them, and they looked disconcertingly as though they had not known sleep in years. The night the black-sailed ships came, the harbour felt wrong before the first mast pierced the mist. The gulls went silent, and the air carried a stillness like the pause before a bell tolls. The tide was high, and the wind at their backs should have driven the vessels in with creaking speed, but they moved as if drawn by a line beneath the water, gliding too smooth for their size. Their hulls were tar-dark, their sails the colour of a moonless sky, and not a single pennant or crest marked their allegiance. The watchmen on the quay leaned on their spears, pretending not to stare, but even at a distance the ships drew eyes. Dockside gossip later swore that the figureheads were carved into the likeness of birds, not doves or gulls, but something with hooked beaks and narrow eyes. No ship in living memory had carried such a design here. The first gangplank thudded down. Instead of unloading crates or calling for porters, the crew moved in a tight group toward the end of the dock. They ignored the harbour master's shouted demands for papers. Their clothes were travel-worn but clean, their boots coated with a faint greenish dust that no one recognized, and at their head walked a man in a dark hood, carrying a case wrapped in oilskin. Mainstream historical fact: in the late Middle Ages, foreign ships suspected of plague were often kept in harbour under guard, sometimes for 40 days, sometimes indefinitely, but enforcement was uneven, and bribes or political pressure could open the gates for a crew that arrived with the right connections or the right intimidation. That night, neither coin nor courtesy seemed to be the reason these men were waved through. The scribe, who had been watching from the shadow of a rope shed, recognized the look in the harbour master's eyes as the crew passed, a kind of acquiescence that wasn't fear of swords, but of something more abstract. Whatever these sailors carried, it had already bought their silence. They didn't head for the taverns, or the warehouses, or the brothels. They went straight into the streets, their boots clicking in eerie unison on the wet stones, and every person they passed turned to look, not at the crew, but at the oilskin-wrapped case in the leader's hands. The scribe followed them into the merchant quarter, careful to keep far enough back that his footfalls could be swallowed by the echo of theirs. The streets narrowed, bent, and widened again, until they stopped outside the cooper's workshop, the masked doctor's quarters above. The leader of the crew looked up at the shuttered window for a long moment, as if considering whether to knock or call. Instead, he stepped aside. Two of the sailors produced a folded slip of parchment, tied with red cord, and left it on the doorstep. Then, without a word, the crew turned and made their way back toward the harbour. The scribe edged closer. The case had not been left behind. Only the note. He bent to read it, but it bore no writing, only a stamped seal, a wheel circled with sprigs, the same monastic emblem he had seen on the resin from the midnight delivery weeks earlier. From above, the shutter creaked. The doctor's mask appeared in the narrow gap, lenses catching the lamplight. He waited until the scribe stepped back, then opened the door and retrieved the note. The case must already have been in his possession. The sailors had simply come to deliver it. Quirky tidbit: some seafaring orders in the Mediterranean kept their own small herb gardens aboard ship, growing plants for medicinal use that thrived better in salt air than in soil. Sailors swore certain varieties, watered only with brine, were more potent than anything grown inland. If the faint scent that drifted from the doctor's quarters later that night was any clue, some of that greenish dust on the sailors' boots had come from such plants. Historians still argue about the ship's origin. Some records claim they came from the south, beyond the usual spice routes. Others point northward toward colder ports known for more esoteric trade. No surviving manifest lists their cargo. What is certain is that they left as silently as they arrived, setting sail before dawn without taking on provisions or unloading goods. In the days after, the doctor's work seemed to shift subtly. His infused cloth strips carried a sharper scent. The smoke from his brazier burned a shade paler, and the patients he treated recovered with even more startling speed. The scribe noted that those patients began speaking the phrase sooner after waking, sometimes within minutes of regaining consciousness. The council noticed too, though they pretended otherwise in public. Behind closed doors they argued whether the black-sailed ships had brought medicine or something far less welcome. Father Matteo began spending more time in the streets, arriving at the doctor's visits uninvited, his eyes always lingering on the satchel. One evening, as the scribe passed the harbour, he saw a fisherman repairing his nets on the quay. The man hummed to himself, 3 short syllables rising and falling like a wave. The phrase, when the scribe asked where he'd learned it, the fisherman nodded toward the open water. From the men on the black ships, he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. That night, the scribe dreamed of the harbour again, but this time the masts were taller than the cathedral spire, and the figureheads were not carved but alive, their eyes turning to follow him as he walked the quay. He woke with the phrase in his mouth and the sound of creaking timbers still in his ears. A winter squall dragged its nails along the roofs, and the cooper's yard smelled of wet oak and stubborn labour. The doctor had left at first light, a line of grey damp marching down his cloak, the satchel balanced as usual against his hip. The scribe waited for that absence to ripen into opportunity. He had tried patient fidelity, he had tried faithful reporting. The ledger had answered by erasing itself. Tonight he would try the oldest method of all in a city built on locked doors, finding the door that had been overlooked. The cooper's wife, who had a practical fondness for order and an impractical fondness for those who kept death at arm's length, let him climb the crooked stair with a nod that said this visit was not happening, and never had. The room welcomed him with its familiar inventory, the bell jar clouded by the breath of herbs, the brass mortar set like a small altar, the narrow table filmed with the chalky residue of ground resins, the cage by the window where Rosemary pretended to be a bird. The air carried the citrus salt tang that had begun to shadow the doctor since the black-sailed ships, a scent that turned the mouth to water and the mind to questions. It was the salt that drew him, not the pinch bowls and folded parchment cones left near the brazier for tinctures, but a larger vessel that hid in plain sight, a heavy stone salt cellar, belly round and modest, the kind a thrifty household would refill once a season and forget about until the stew needed rescuing. The scribe had seen it before, had ignored it the way the mind ignores ordinary objects in a room full of mysteries. Tonight, he slid it toward the lamplight. Its weight resisted in a way that spoke of more than salt. He turned the vessel and found, near the base, a seam that felt too deliberate for a mason's accident. The lid seemed fixed, but the belly rang a dull note under his knuckles. The scribe's fingers, which had learned secrets from book clasps and guild chests, found the place where stone yielded to intention. A twist, a lift, a scrape like a sigh, and the cellar opened along its equator to show a cavity within, lined in waxed linen and crystal grains that gleamed like snow in lamplight. Nestled among the salt lay 3 stoppered jars the size of fists, glass the colour of tea, and something wrapped in oiled silk as carefully as a relic. Mainstream historical fact to steady the hand that reaches into dark places. In the Middle Ages, salt was the great preserver, prized as coin, weapon, and covenant. Butchers buried meat in it. Apothecaries packed rarities in it. Monks who could not afford cool cellars made do with salt's refusal to let time do its work. Private anatomists, where they existed at all, used it when cold air and quick knives failed. He lifted the first jar. It sloshed with a viscous confidence, the liquid thickened by dissolved crystals. Within floated a pale shape that looked, at first, like a misshapen pear. He turned the jar slowly. The pear sprouted a stem that was not a stem but a slender tube, and on the opposite side a scalloped edge like the lip of a pitcher. A heart, preserved in salt and resin, its colour gone to candle wax. The second jar held something more delicate, laced with threads like the roots of a winter plant. A lung collapsed to a fist, alveoli dimples softened by time. The third jar refused identification as he turned it in his hands, a coiled slickness he did not want to name. He set them down with the care of a man who understands that shock requires gentleness. Historians still argue whether these were human remains or animal analogues, taken from pigs or sheep as stand-ins for the forbidden. The church in most ports frowned at dissection, though allowances flickered from bishop to bishop like candlelight in a draught. There were places, to be fair, where university anatomies unrolled without scandal under the calendar's blessing, but those places were not here, and the beaked mask upstairs belonged to a city that hid its contraband learning under kitchen tools. The oiled silk parcel crackled softly as he untied its tiny knots. Inside lay a folded map on vellum, corners weighted by habit into memory. It smelled of herbs, not mildew, as if it had been aired regularly and stored with sprigs pressed between the sheets, the way ladies kept summer inside winter books. He spread it on the table and felt the room lean closer. The map did not show streets. It was not a harbour chart or a pilgrim's itinerary. It was a field of circles and lines, an orchard of glyphs. Concentric rings nested like ripples in a basin, some annotated with the doctor's narrow script, others dotted by hand-drawn stars. In the lower corner, a shape that looked suspiciously like the outline of this very port hunched in profile, the headland and river a crude sketch. From this crude head radiated arcs that curved inland and seaward both, each arc marked with the same 4 small symbols repeated in different orders, like a child's game of arranging tiles into words. The scribe traced one arc at random, and stopped when it intersected a sigil he knew too well, the wheel circled by sprigs. The monastery's emblem had been inked small beside 3 of the arcs, as if acknowledging a relay point rather than claiming authorship. He found elsewhere a tiny cross, like a cathedral's floor plan at the edge of town, placed where Father Matteo's church would be if this were a real map. He found near the docks a symbol he did not recognize, 2 hooked beaks facing one another across a line that might be a mast. Quirky tidbit, because sleep has always made room for oddities. There were painters 2 centuries later who ground a pigment called mummy brown from imported mummified flesh, stirring the dead into oils for the living to admire on walls. If one believes that ingredients carry intention, the idea sits in the mind like a stone in a shoe. The scribe, ignorant of future pigments, nonetheless felt that same pebble of unease as he looked from the jars to the map, from the preserved to the projected. He searched the room for a key, and found it where the doctor always hid his simplicity, in plain sight. The narrow leather book lay on the shelf, a strip of red thread marking a page well thumbed. He did not open it. He had learned that reading the doctor's notes was like reading weather, accurate but indifferent to whether the reader carried an umbrella. Instead, he looked at the rosemary cage. The sprig inside was greener than any sprig deserved to be in winter. He lifted the bell jar from the drying strips, let the sharper smoke from the new resin kiss the vellum's edge, and watched the ink wake. Lines the color of old wine rose from the map like submerged reeds when wind ruffles the surface. The circles brightened, not with light but with clarity, edges snapping into intention. In the margin, words appeared that had been hidden under a wash of something volatile, the way a palimpsest gives up its first voice when coaxed. Entries of moon phase paired to wind direction, to tide height, to the direction taken by traders on the first day after they recovered. It was not a map of streets, it was a map of transmissions. The phrase was inked into it over and over, not spelled out, letter by letter, but marked by the 4 small symbols in sequence, the same 4 he had seen slip under his own hand, the night his index betrayed him. Historians still argue whether the doctor had found a way to treat breath like a carrier pigeon, training it to bear a syllable from place to place, or whether he had only charted a phenomenon that would have happened with or without him. The debate grows polite at the edges and heated in the middle, because at its core sits an insult to agency that scholars prefer to avoid. The scribe worked by habit. Now, drawing the map quickly on a scrap of paper with a blunt pencil stub, copying the sequence of the 4 symbols from 2 arcs, committing the rest to the strange house of memory he had been building since the cupboard was emptied, he returned the jars to their bed of salt. He resealed the cellar with the reverence one reserves for reliquaries and crimes. He folded the map back into its silk, pressed the creases with his fingertips and left it exactly where it had been. Before he went, he stood by the window and watched the alley the way watchers have always watched alleys, pretending patience is the same as control. Rain freckled the sill. The rosemary trembled minutely in air that ought to have been still. He thought of the dockworker walking when he was supposed to be dead. He thought of the merchant's wife waking before dawn and asking for water in a voice that had room for a foreign syllable she had never learned. He thought of the black-sailed ships and the beaks carved into their prows, looking past men toward harbours no map admitted. On his way out, he paused by the basin and washed his hands in vinegar, the way the doctor had taught a whole neighbourhood to do without making a sermon of it. Vinegar could not unwind secrets, but it could clear the air in a small circle around a man, and sometimes a small circle is enough to keep breathing. He left the stair quietly, the cooper's wife busying herself with barrels she had already arranged twice. In the street, the city felt like a mouth trying out a new word. He tucked the pencil sketch into his sleeve beside the folded page, the two edges brushing like conspirators. Somewhere beyond the rain, a bell counted the hour. Somewhere beneath his feet, salt preserved what time would otherwise demand. And on a table in an upper room, a map of breath waited for the hand that had drawn it to return, as if confident that even discovery could be folded back into routine, the way a lid finds its threads and turns home. The aldermen met that night in the long-beamed chamber above the Guildhall, the fire in the hearth fighting a losing battle with the damp that curled in from the sea. The air smelled faintly of wet wool and worry. Wax dripped onto the minutes ledger as the clerk wrote in a cramped hand, glancing often at the closed door as though expecting it to open without knocking. The item under discussion was officially matters of public order. In truth, it was the masked doctor. Reports had reached them from every quarter: the black-sailed ships, the monastery seal on the sailor's message, the jars of remedies no one could identify, the map no one had seen but everyone had heard about, in the way one hears about the price of grain, through whispers too persistent to ignore. But more pressing than any of these was the change in the city's rhythm. Mainstream historical fact: in times of epidemic, the management of public morale was as important to civic leaders as the management of disease. A population that believed itself cursed or manipulated could erupt into riots, pogroms, or mass flight, any of which could be as ruinous as the illness itself. The councillors sat in a horseshoe around the table, each speaking in turn with the measured caution of men testing a frozen pond. Alderman Carvone, whose voice was as smooth as the wax on his boots, opened with what many were already thinking. We cannot have one man, one stranger, command such influence over our survival, he said. If he leaves, we are undone. If he stays, we are beholden. Alderman Brecht countered that the Dr. Sipp's cures had saved more than half the names on the death rolls since his arrival. If we exile him, Brecht said, we may as well stack the plague carts again. The Merchant Guild's representative, her cloak still wet from the walk across the square, leaned forward. And if we keep him, how long before every decision in this city, trade, tax, dock tariffs, is weighed against whether it pleases him to continue his work? Men who can grant life rarely settle for the fee they're given. It was Alderman Sarto, who almost never spoke unless cornered, who voiced the real fear. It's not the man, he said, tapping one thin finger against the table. It's the word, the phrase. It's in the mouths of those he's touched. Yes, but now it's in the mouths of those he hasn't. We don't know what it means, and we don't know what it does. That's a danger I can't measure, and a danger I can't tax. The clerk's pen hesitated at that, blotting the parchment. Historians still argue whether the vote that night was truly unanimous. The surviving record claims it was, but given the divisions in the chamber before, it's more likely a fragile consensus, stitched together by mutual unease. The terms were blunt. The doctor would be summoned to the Guildhall and offered two choices. He could accept formal appointment as Master of Public Health, with all the authority to direct quarantine, treatment and sanitation, subject to council oversight, or he could be required to leave the city within 7 days. Quirky tidbit: in several plague-struck cities, the Office of Public Health was created not to empower physicians, but to confine them, to make them accountable to the same bureaucracy as bakers and bricklayers. A title could be a gilded cage as easily as a crown. The scribe was sent to deliver the summons at dawn. He found the doctor in a narrow alley off the market, tending to a Cooper's child who had collapsed from fever. The beaked mask turned toward him as he read the council's decree aloud. The doctor listened without interruption, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had already guessed. He did not speak, he rarely did, but he placed one gloved hand on the child's brow, adjusted the infused cloth over her face, and rose. The scribe noticed the satchel was already packed. The meeting in the Guildhall took place the next morning. The aldermen sat in full regalia, their cloaks arranged to suggest warmth and unity. The doctor entered without ceremony, his mask's dark lenses reflecting the firelight. The council's offer was read aloud: authority or exile. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the doctor reached into his satchel and withdrew the narrow leather book. He set it on the table in front of the aldermen. One of them, Brecht, the advocate for keeping him, opened it. The pages were filled with the neat script the scribe knew well, columns of names, dates, wind and tide notations, and beside each, the 4 small symbols the scribe had seen on the hidden map. The aldermen glanced at one another. None of them could read the symbol's meaning, but the presence of such an orderly, coded record suggested a mind already well practiced in keeping its own counsel. The Merchant Guild's representative closed the book and slid it back across the table. "We will give you the title," Carvoni said, "and the authority it grants, but you will answer to this council." The doctor inclined his head once, took the book, and left without another word. The scribe, trailing him into the square, noticed something unsettling. The phrase was being whispered among the crowd outside, not just by those cured, but by onlookers, council guards, even a pair of guild apprentices who had no business being there. The word was in the air like a draft through a cracked door. That night, the scribe wrote in his journal, "We have not caged him. We have invited ourselves inside the cage." It started with the smell of smoke that wasn't from any hearth. Sharp, dry, and almost sweet, the scent of burning paper. By the time the scribe reached the cathedral square, a knot of people had gathered, their faces lit by a flickering orange that licked at the night air. The source was the archive wing of the church, its narrow windows glowing like the eyes of an old saint in a fever dream. 2 acolytes staggered out with armfuls of salvaged hymnals, their robes singed at the hem. Father Matteo stood at the door, sleeves rolled, his face slick with sweat, directing a bucket line from the well. The flames hissed and spat where the water struck, but the smoke only thickened, turning the square into a chamber of ghosts. The scribe forced his way to Matteo's side. "What's burning?" he asked. The confessor's eyes shifted for a fraction of a second before returning to the fire. "Old records," Matteo said. "Genealogies, plague rolls. We tried to save the most recent." His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone reciting a prepared line. Mainstream historical fact: during outbreaks, church archives often held not only sacramental records but detailed mortality lists, sometimes the only official record of who lived, who died, and how quickly. They were invaluable for posterity, but in the wrong hands they could also reveal uncomfortable truths, failures to report deaths, patterns in recovery, or discrepancies in burial rites. The scribe caught sight of a charred edge fluttering on the cobblestones. He stooped, plucked it up. It was a fragment of parchment, the ink still legible in places, a column of names, dates, and he froze, a margin mark of 4 small symbols, repeated in different sequences. The same marks he'd seen in the doctor's book, the same on the hidden map. He closed his hand over it, before the water splashed his boots. Matteo noticed. "Give me that," he said, not loudly, but with a gravity that made the scribe Sip's fingers tighten. "It's Sip's evidence," the scribe replied. Matteo Sip's jaw set. "Is Sip's a temptation?" Before the scribe could answer, a shout went up from the far side of the square. One of the buckets had overturned, spilling water that steamed on the flagstones, carrying with it a trail of ash into the gutter. In the confusion, Matteo stepped forward, palm out. For a moment the scribe thought he might try to take the scrap by force. Instead, the priest's hand lowered. "Keep it," he said, "but don't show it to anyone you don't trust to keep breathing." By dawn, the archive wing was a blackened husk. The bishop issued a statement that the fire had been an accident, an overturned lamp. The scribe, who had seen the heavy iron sconces inside, doubted it. Quirky tidbit. There are accounts from other plague years of mysterious fires destroying only the sections of archives dealing with health records, while the rest of the building survived. Officially, such losses were lamented. Unofficially, they sometimes spared the authorities from answering questions. Historians still argue whether this fire was meant to erase proof of the phrase's spread, to conceal patterns in the doctor's patients, or simply to burn away the last records tying certain cures to certain names. Whatever the reason, the loss was total. The scribe examined the scrap by lamplight that evening. The names on it were mostly familiar. Dock workers, a weaver's apprentice, the merchant's wife, but there was one he did not recognize, marked with a date 3 months past, and a sequence of the 4 symbols he had never seen before. It was unlike any other in his notes. He copied it into the corner of his own ledger, marking it with a cross so faint it would vanish under a careless thumb. The doctor said nothing about the fire. When the scribe mentioned it, he merely checked the tide chart in his book, as though the destruction of a city's memory was just another shift in the wind. 2 days later, the phrase was heard in the streets again, louder, more frequent, not whispered this time, but spoken plainly, woven into greetings, slipped into the ends of sentences. The scribe swore he heard it in the marketplace twice from the mouths of strangers speaking 2 different languages. That night, in the council chamber, Alderman Sato muttered that the fire might have burned the records, but it had not burned whatever was in the people. Cavone asked if he meant the sickness or the cure. Sato said nothing. From the window of his quarters, the scribe could see the scorched skeleton of the archive wing. The air still smelled faintly of rosemary, though no herbs had been stored there. He held the scrap of parchment up to the light, tracing the unfamiliar sequence of symbols with his finger. Somewhere in the city, the person tied to that entry was still alive. He wondered if they were speaking the phrase tonight, and whether they knew they were part of a record that now existed only in his sleeve. He arrived on a wind that had crossed more sand than sea, a long-armed man with the walk of someone who trusts horizons. His cloak was sun-bleached to a modest grey that once dreamed of indigo, and his satchel had the sagging dignity of a library that decided to go for a stroll. He gave his name to no one who mattered to paper, paid for a bowl of stew with a coin whose face the innkeeper pretended to recognize, and unrolled, on a corner table that leaned like an old sailor, a narrow packet of rubbings and sketches. The scribe heard about him the way he heard about everything now, as if the city had added a nerve just to keep him busy. He entered the inn, and found the man coaxing a candle to stop guttering, as he weighed the edge of a dog-eared parchment with a small stone that looked suspiciously like a fossilized date. The drawings were not of faces or ships or the usual saints. They were of signs, hooked bars, small circles, lines knotted like reeds. 4 of them, repeated, reordered, marching across a page in sequences that made the scribe's stomach remember the cupboard emptied of books. The scholar, because surely that was what a man like this insisted upon being, spoke in a rivering accent that moved around hard stones instead of scraping its shins on them. He had come from the desert, he said, was not on most maps, a place where words were not carved to be seen but to endure. He had made rubbings from black basalt stelae, half buried in dunes where the wind forgot itself and stopped to think. The 4 signs, he said, belonged to a vanished kingdom that traded in copper and salt and mortality, a nation that lived by wells and vanished when those wells decided to belong to someone else. Mainstream historical fact, set down like a tent peg in shifting sand. Medieval travellers did carry back news of scripts. No one at home could read, making rubbings on thin parchment or wax tablets from stones and walls that outlived the names of their builders. Scholars traded these impressions the way merchants traded spice lists, and sometimes a monastery wall held a rubbing of letters older than the church it hung inside. The scribe watched the scholar rearrange 4 small counters on the table, each counter painted with one of the signs in red ochre. He slid them as one might slide gaming pieces, composing sequences that echoed the ones the scribe had seen in the doctor's book, and on the map, hidden in the salt cellar. The inn's hum softened around them, as if the room had leaned in. When one order settled under the scholar's hand, he tapped it twice, then brushed his fingers across his own throat in a gesture that looked like habit and sounded like warning. The scribe felt the phrase climb up his tongue and pressed his lips together until it went back downstairs. The scholar did not ask for coin, He asked for paper and patience, and perhaps a little quiet, while he explained the meaning he believed he had netted from the desert's bones. He traced the 4 signs again, giving each its simplest gloss: breath, return, house, remember. In different orders, he said, they made different imperatives. Remember the breath that returns to its house. The breath remembers the house that returns. Return the house. Remember breath. The scribe, who had not slept well in weeks, felt each version fit the city like a different mask. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind the candle. The scholar's ink smelled faintly of saffron because it was. Some travellers carried powdered spice for ink, mixing it with water and gum on the spot. If you licked the end of the quill afterward, you tasted a festival and stained your tongue the colour of saints' halos for an hour. The scribe did not lick the quill. He had learned lately to put his tongue only where breathing would thank him. Historians still argue whether this so-called translation was anything more than clever guesswork, a scholar's desire to make pattern into meaning. There are no surviving grammars of the Desert Kingdom he described that would pass a university's sniff test, but there are other things that pass a different test entirely. The way a room's attention falls into place when a stranger says words that fit too well. The way a scribe's palm sweats at the exact moment a theory shakes hands with a fear. Father Matteo appeared at the inn door, as if summoned by the smell of old ideas and new trouble. He stood behind the scribe and listened with his eyes. The scholar, polite as a man who has made a career out of not being burned, acknowledged him with a nod and spread a fresh rubbing. This one showed the 4 signs carved into a circle around something that might have been a stylized well or a mouth. Around that circle, smaller cuts like rays. The scholar called it the house glyph. He said it often appeared near mentions of fever and offerings of resin and wine. He said it was a thing that swallowed and did not always give back. The scribe glanced at the priest, who did not flinch but did press his thumb into his palm once, hard enough to blanch the nail. The phrase had begun in their city with a mask and a vial and rosemary trapped in a cage. Now it had acquired a genealogy and a graveyard. The masked doctor arrived as if the city had decided this table needed all its trouble in one place. He came without the mask, which was an event by itself, the beak held in the crook of his arm like a musician's instrument between sets. His face was lean and wind-burned with the privacy of a man who spent more time with air than with people. His eyes, when they slid over the rubbings, did not widen. He reached once toward the 4 counters, rearranged them silently into a sequence the scholar had not yet demonstrated, and let his hand rest there, a small weight on a new order. The scholar breathed out through his nose as if a door he had suspected was real had just opened and asked to be fed. The inn kept moving around them. Alice sloshed, a spoon dropped. Someone laughed at a joke that had marinated in wine too long. The scribe copied the new sequence into his ledger, the one that kept choosing between obedience and sabotage. He wrote slowly, letting each sign arrive in its own time, the way the doctor counted pulse beats. The scholar told a story as old as thirst, about a city that bargained with breath. When fever came, the keepers of the wells taught the recovered a phrase that made memory follow them like faithful dogs. The phrase was not prayer, he said, though prayers had tried to wear it. It was instruction. The breath returns to its house. Say it, and the lungs remember how. Say it, and the body stands where it had fallen. Say it, and the next house learns the shape of the door. Mainstream fact nested beside the fiction, charms and amulets against fever were common across the medieval world, from Italy to the Maghreb to the Levant, often blending folk practice with bits of scripture and scraps of older tongues. A traveller could hear the same cadence in 3 markets and not realize the words had been swapped for whatever the locals trusted. The mind loves a rhythm more than it loves a dictionary. The scholar did not claim the phrase conferred immortality. He claimed it trained breath to remember a path, the way a mule remembers the road to the mill even if the rider drifts. He confessed, in the careful way of someone who believes confession is a form of currency, that sometimes the wells dried anyway, and then the desert taught a different lesson entirely. He let the counters sit in the doctor's order, and did not move them again. Father Matteo thanked him with the kind of courtesy that tastes like steel. He asked where the rubbings were made, which monastery had copied them, whether any bishop had seen them. The scholar shrugged the shrug of a man who has learned to travel with answers that do not invite more questions. He said the desert and left it there. The scribe took the counters in his mind and fitted them over his city, as if over a map, the way a shipwright fits a template to a hull. Breath, return, house, remember. The dock worker, walking when he should have been on a cart under sackcloth, remember. The merchant's wife waking before dawn and asking for water, breath. The black-sailed ships whose crews spoke little, but walked like men who had rehearsed the streets before, return. The jars in the salt cellar, little houses where the body learns its geography, house. He felt the strange satisfaction of adjusting a picture frame and finding that the room looks less crooked. He also felt the quiet terror of realizing that a frame was there at all, and that someone had hung it for him. Historians still argue whether that day in the inn was when the city stopped thinking of the phrase as a quirk and started thinking of it as an engine, something that could be tuned, misused, broken, repaired. The scholar left a gift the size of a thumbnail, a tiny clay token pressed with the 4 signs in the doctor's order. He said it was baked in desert heat and would outlast any rain this city could manufacture. The scribe kept it in the same sleeve as the folded page and the pencil sketch of the map, the 3 edges clicking together when he walked as if gossiping. Quirky corollary to that tidbit. Some travellers swore clay held words better than vellum, that a baked syllable could be buried like a bulb and still sprout when unearthed centuries later. The scribe did not intend to test that theory, but he liked the way the token warmed in his palm when he thought too hard. That evening, he and Father Matteo walked the long way around the cathedral square. The archive wing still smelled of old smoke and things that had been true yesterday. Matteo said little, only that some words walked into the church and asked to be baptized whether the font agreed or not. The scribe said less, because he had begun to recognize the shape of silence that was not ignorance but conservation. In the doctor's room above the cooper's yard, the rosemary in the cage stood too green for winter. The map in silk slept where it had always slept. The salt held its secrets with the patience of geography. Down in the inn, the candle burned low and guttered at last, but the counters kept their order on the table, 4 small instructions waiting for a hand to move them again. The festival came early that year, as though the city had decided that paper lanterns and painted masks could outpace the smell of sickness still clinging to its stones. By noon, the market squares were bright with banners, the alleys strung with garlands of evergreen and dried orange slices, and the air full of the soft percussion of drums that had not been heard since before the plague. Masks were everywhere. Foxes, stags, suns, moons, faces with exaggerated grins or weeping eyes. For once the beaked plague mask was not a sign of dread but part of the carnival. Children wore them made of painted papier-mâché, bobbing through the crowd like little carrion birds, scattering petals instead of ash. The anonymity was perfect cover for anyone who wished to vanish into the noise. The scribe had not seen the doctor in 3 days. He had expected him to appear at the morning's council inspection of the market stalls, but the place at the edge of the square where he usually lingered was empty. Father Matteo, moving through the crowd with the composure of a man who could spot a confession under a crown, told him quietly, "If he means to go, this is the day." Mainstream historical fact in many medieval cities, feast days and festivals were when debts were quietly settled. Exiles made their exits, and disappearances were staged. The crush of the crowd, the blur of masks, the clamour of music, all made for a kind of civic blindness, an agreed-upon ignorance. The scribe stationed himself at the fountain in the merchant quarter, where the crowd flowed in from 3 streets. From here he could see the faces, or the painted stand-ins that passed, the satchels slung over shoulders, the cloaks clasped tight against the winter wind. The phrase was in the air, braided into laughter, shouted from one mask to another as part of some street game. It was impossible to tell who spoke it first anymore. Then he saw him, not in the black coat and bird mask, but in a plain wool cloak, hood drawn low, the satchel smaller than usual. He moved with the same unhurried certainty, but now it read differently, less like the patience of a man who has time, more like the pace of one who knows exactly when the tide will turn. The scribe followed, careful to keep a pair of masked revellers between them. The doctor crossed the square, weaving through dancers, pausing only once when a child in a fox mask ran into him. He steadied the child with a hand on the shoulder, leaned close, too close for it to be only an apology, and then moved on. The child turned to watch him go, then joined the game again, murmuring the phrase in time with the drum beat. They passed under a canopy of ribbons, down a lane lined with food stalls. The smells of roasting chestnuts, fried dough, and spiced wine crowded the air. The doctor stopped at none of them. He walked straight to the small gate at the east wall, the one usually kept for cart traffic. Today it stood open, a pair of guards in half armour too busy arguing over a wager to check papers closely. Quirky tidbit: some city gates during festivals were left unmanned for hours, especially if they opened onto routes considered safe. That trust was often misplaced. The doctor slipped into the flow of masked townsfolk leaving for the fields, some to visit relatives outside the walls, others to light bonfires on the hilltops. The scribe followed, feeling the weight of the folded page and the clay token in his sleeve, as though they might shift and betray him. Outside the wall, the road curved sharply, and the noise of the festival faded to a distant throb. At the bend, the doctor paused. He turned, not enough to reveal his full face, just enough for the scribe to see the shadow of a smile that might have been acknowledgement or farewell. Then he stepped into the line of travellers again, blending so perfectly with the capes and masks that within a dozen heartbeats he was gone. Historians still argue about what happened next. Some say he left the city entirely, moving from plague town to plague town until his trail vanished. Others claim he stayed in disguise, working under other names, other masks. A few insist he boarded one of the black-sailed ships when it returned in the night, sailing for a place where the phrase was older than walls. The scribe lingered at the bend until the last of the travellers passed, until the road beyond lay empty except for the wind playing with the dry grass. When he returned to the city, the festival was at its height. Music filled the squares, masks turned toward the bonfires, and the phrase moved from mouth to mouth like a toast that had outgrown its speaker. That night, in his room above the cooper's yard, he opened the cupboard where his new ledger lay. On the first page, he wrote the 4 small symbols in the order the doctor had left them on the inn table. Beneath them, in his own hand, he wrote "Vanished during the Feast of Lanterns." Then he closed the book, set the rosemary sprig upright in its jar, and blew out the lamp. In the dark, the city's murmurs found their way through the shutters. Somewhere far below, the phrase rose and fell with the same ease as breath, carried now by voices that had never seen the mask, never felt the satchel's weight, never stood under the gaze of glass-black eyes, and yet they spoke it as if they had been there all along. Winter thickened its hold on the port, wrapping the alleys in frost that creaked underfoot, and painting the rooftops with a powder so fine it blew away if you breathed too close. The festival lanterns were long extinguished, their coloured paper curling into itself in forgotten gutters, but the phrase remained, a quiet guest in conversations, humming between sentences like a note in a song no one admitted to knowing. The scribe noticed it most in the marketplace. The fishmongers used it when greeting each other over the rows of glistening catch. Bakers murmured it as they passed trays of bread from one pair of hands to another. Children whispered it, when skipping rope, as naturally as they counted the turns. It had detached from its origin entirely, become part of the city's background music, and no one seemed to realize that every repetition stitched the pattern tighter. Mainstream historical fact: language can outlast its meaning. Many medieval blessings, charms, and warnings were repeated for centuries after their purpose was forgotten, woven into daily speech simply because they felt right in the mouth. The plague phrase had taken root in precisely this way. Father Matteo returned from a visit to the outer parishes with news that unsettled him enough to ignore his supper. The phrase had spread beyond the walls. Farmers used it at the end of deals for grain or timber. A miller's wife miles upriver had spoken it when handing him a cup of water. She swore she had learned it from her grandmother, an impossibility unless time itself had become part of the contagion. The scribe compared his notes from the summer to those from this week. The distribution was wider now, not just among the doctor's former patients, but throughout all ranks and trades. He marked on his map, his own, not the doctor's, each location he'd overheard it in the last month. The pins formed no neat circle, no tidy progression. It was as though the city had breathed it out in all directions at once. Quirky tidbit: in some plague towns, people hung sprigs of rosemary in doorways year-round as a charm against illness. Here, the herb was beginning to appear, not just in doorways but in patterns, bundles tied with red string and placed on well edges, window sills, and even under market stalls. Matteo swore these bundles were new, not part of any local tradition. The scribe began noting their locations too, and found they often coincided with the densest clusters of phrase use. Historians still argue whether the doctor intended this spread or simply failed to contain it. Without him, the city lacked both a source and a steward for the cure, or the contagion, depending on how one framed it. And without the council's oversight, there was no one to record who was first to speak it in each place, or whether those speakers had changed in some other subtler way. One evening, the scribe returned to his quarters to find the clay token missing from his sleeve box. In its place lay a sprig of rosemary bound with red thread. The knot was a precise cross, the ends cut clean. No note, no sign of forced entry. The window latch was still fastened. Matteo's expression when shown the bundle was unreadable. "It's not meant as harm," he said at last. "It's meant as inclusion," he would not explain further. That night, the scribe dreamed of the doctor, not the man but the mask, suspended in the dark, its glass eyes catching light from nowhere. The beak moved as if breathing, and when it exhaled, the phrase came out, slow and steady, each word landing like a foot on a stair. He woke with the taste of rosemary in his mouth, though he had eaten none. The council, perhaps sensing the shape of something they could neither claim nor forbid, avoided speaking of the doctor at all. They addressed trade levies, grain shortages, and the repair of the Eastern Gate, but not the phrase. Yet when votes were tallied, the scribe noticed a subtle hesitation, as though each alderman waited for the others to speak first, as though they feared saying the wrong thing in the wrong order. In the streets, the pattern of rosemary bundles continued to grow. By the month's end there was one on the well in Rope Maker's Lane, where the doctor had first been seen. The scribe stood there in the early dawn, breath smoking in the air, and watched a woman touch the bundle before lowering her bucket. She did not speak the phrase aloud, but her lips moved. It occurred to him then that the phrase might no longer need sound to travel. Perhaps it had crossed into gesture, into habit, into the private rituals that shaped a city's unseen life. He imagined the doctor somewhere far away, pausing on a road or in a harbour, feeling, not hearing, that the work was still being done. The thought was both comfort and warning. Centuries gathered dust the way harbours gather stories, and in a museum built from a retired customs house, where smugglers once declared only half their cargo, a sealed chest waited behind a row of taxidermied seabirds. The label on its shelf read only miscellany, port warden's effects, provenance uncertain. The key had gone missing sometime between an overzealous inventory in the 18th century and a war that rattled glass in its frames, so the chest learned patience and woodworm and the unsentimental tick of the climate control fan. On a Tuesday that smelled of old paper and floor wax, a junior curator in a cardigan full of ink stains set the chest on a foam cradle and coaxed the rusted hasp open with oil, soft cloth and persistence. The lid sighed like a retiree settling into a chair. Inside lay an order that made the breath still, the long-beaked mask, its leather gone to velvet, and its lenses cloudy as winter pond ice, a braid of tools rolled in oiled linen, a narrow book whose spine had separated into faithful leaves, and a parchment folded around a sprig pressed so flat it cast no shadow, yet still gave off the faintest clarity of rosemary when the folder opened. Mainstream historical fact to anchor this unboxing: the iconic beak masks most people picture belongs to the 17th century Italian plague doctors, who stuffed the beak with herbs against miasma and wore waxed coats against contagion. Historians still argue whether any 14th century practitioners in northern ports used a similar mask, or whether later fashion and memory embroidered earlier practice. The specimen in the chest did not quite fit the Venetian pattern. Its beak was shorter, its lenses less bulbous, and a wire cage had been sewn inside the beak, sized exactly for a sprig. The tools rolled out in a quiet chorus of small clicks: polished bone probes, horn-handled lancets, a brazier cup no larger than a child's fist, with resin still ghosting its walls, and tucked in a side pocket, tiny clay counters, stamped with 4 signs. The catalogue software refused to translate, because software is clever about dates, but dense about deserts. The junior curator laid them in a shallow tray for photography, and when the studio light warmed them, an herb and tar scent rose as if the room had remembered its own lungs. Quirky tidbit. Filed where curators keep their superstitions, some archive rooms nest sachets of rosemary and lavender into drawers to discourage insects from nibbling manuscripts. The museum's conservator, who practiced this quiet magic, grinned when the scent reached him from the chest and swore he had not touched the sachet shelf. The smell seeped anyway, proof that time sometimes writes its own labels. The narrow book had not survived like the mask. It had flourished. Its pages were tight with neat script, columns of wind and tide and moon, patient names and outcomes, and marching in a second hand between the lines, the four small symbols that had once made a scribe's stomach drop. The last leaves held a map that did not map streets, only arcs and circles and breath, inked with a patience that felt intimate even across centuries. The curator did not understand the signs, only the stubborn tenderness that had placed them. When she lifted the parchment wrapped around the pressed sprig, a dusting of crystals glittered on the foam. "Salt," the conservator said, leaning close. "Not from the sea," he added, after tasting a pinpoint that protocol did not recommend, but habit allowed, because conservators have always been part cat and part priest. The parchment carried a line of 4 symbols repeated in an order the database would later tag only as sequence E. A tiny note in the margin, in the same neat hand as the ledger, placed the day, Feast of Lanterns. The year had been wiped by some old damp, but the hand still trusted the page. The museum director asked for provenance. The junior curator traced the chest's path back through ledgers and mismatched inventories to a deaccessioned parish storehouse, then to a shuttered guild hall, then to an alderman's estate sale where a clerk had scribbled bird mask, vulgar, dispose or keep, and circled keep as if embarrassed. A single invoice browned to tobacco mentioned a chest of plague relics transferred from the Office of Public Health when the post was dissolved. The signature, a looped C that might have been Carvone, answered nothing and gave permission to ask more. Historians still argue whether the mask in the chest belonged to the doctor who walked those fogged streets, or to another who borrowed his methods and his silence. They argue whether the 4 counters are copies or originals, and whether the rosemary's scent is chemistry or myth that survived in cellulose for the pleasure of latecomers. They argue too whether the parchment's phrase is instruction or mere echo, and whether echo can teach as much as the first shout. They agree on only this: someone meant these objects to outlast scandal and praise alike. The junior curator wrote the exhibit label with the calm of a person who sleeps near stacks of unindexed diaries. Decorative medical attire, Cannes, 1600s, possibly earlier, she typed. Then, after a long sip of cold tea, deleted the word decorative. She added a second line for the book: ledger of patients and environmental notations, anonymous physician. In small print, she tucked a line about the mystery symbols, inviting visitors to propose translations while gently discouraging them from inventing curses in the guestbook. Opening day brought schoolchildren with sticky fingers and retirees with sharper eyes than the lighting designer would have preferred. A fisherman's descendant stood before the glass and tapped his pocket the way his grandfather had always tapped a ring, and whispered the phrase without knowing why. A language student traced the counters with her gaze and wrote a paper about proto-syllabaries that made her professor smile and pencil a question mark in the margin like a benediction. A young respiratory therapist on holiday stood for a long time in front of the mask and thought about the shape of air. Late one afternoon, the junior curator found herself alone in the gallery. The HVAC clicked its domestic metronome. Outside, gulls argued about pastries. She leaned close to the glass and watched her breath fog, then fade. The mask on its stand reflected her face where its lenses had clouded to softness. The rosemary pressed in the parchment did not move, because time no longer made such demands of it, but the scent found her anyway, the way a song finds a person in a market, years after the singer has vanished into a festival crowd. In a drawer in the study room, visitors could request to see the clay counters up close. They sat on black velvet like seeds kept for a garden no one had the deed to anymore. The conservator, who had warmed to his borrowed priesthood, warned volunteers not to touch their tongues to the counters because history already dissolves quickly enough without help. Still, He admitted under his breath that every time he reboxed them, he felt as if he were tucking children into sleep. The catalogue record ended with a line that was almost an apology and almost a promise. Associations with local plague narratives unverified. The junior curator added, in her private notebook that lived under the foam cradle, a different line. Objects remember for us when we forget on purpose. On some evenings, just before the alarms armed for the night, she thought she heard a faint cadence at the edge of the room's hush, as if paper remembered the weight of a pen and was demonstrating. She always blamed the fan. She always planned the next rotation of labels. She always left a tiny sachet of rosemary under the display case, more for her than for the moths, and when she locked the gallery door and turned away, the mask's glass eyes held the light like a harbour does at dusk, steady and unafraid, as if something that had once roamed streets and measured pulse and mapped breath had decided that waiting too was a form of work. The museum settles with the evening, the lights dimming to gentler pools that make every surface look kinder, the glass softening its reflections until the mask becomes more silhouette than instrument and the ledger, for once, stops asking to be read. The hum of the fans evens out, patient and unshowy, like a cat curled on a windowsill in the last of the sun, and somewhere a stair ticks as wood moves against its old nails, not complaining, only remembering that it knows how to hold. A guard on the late shift walks the corridor with steps that respect the floor, glancing in without lingering, trusting the cases to do the small magic they do all night. Keep what needs keeping, breathe what needs breathing. In the distance, tires on wet street whisper the way the river once did under the quay, a hush that rounds the corners of thought. The rosemary under the case adds nothing loud to the air, only a clean line the mind can follow without looking, a path from nose to chest to the place behind the ribs where calm decides it might like to live. It helps sometimes to picture the scribe closing his cupboard, satisfied with the day's work, or the doctor adjusting a strip of linen with fingers that never hurried even when haste would have been forgiven. It helps to imagine the festival lanterns guttering at last, the masks hung on pegs, the square emptying into an ordinary night where ovens cool and cats patrol and somewhere a single window stays lit because someone there is reading just one more page. The phrase, once a ripple of worry across a whole harbour, recedes to something gentler here, less command than lullaby, a cadence the lungs understand without being told. The mind will still offer questions, because that is its hobby, and we can let it, the way a kind host lets the last guest linger at the door, telling one more story. Historians still argue, of course they do, about dates and masks, and the proper footnotes for a life lived in alleys and sea wind. We can let them too. Their voices can be the soft talk from a neighbouring room, while our own room learns the shape of quiet. Breath returns to its house. The house remembers the breath. Tonight, those are just gentle shapes the thoughts can rest inside, like shells placed in a row on a sill, catching the last light, then keeping it safe through the dark. So let the picture fade a little. The chest closed again, the gallery dark, the ledger's pages lying still as a sleeping lake, the clay counters tucked in their nest. Let the beak soften to a harmless curve, and the glass to two small moons. If there is a whisper at all, let it be only the fan and the friendly friction of blanket against sheet. Should a word drift close, let it pass like a boat in fog, seen then gone, leaving only the clean wake of breathing in its path. Sleep arrives best when it is invited, but not chased, when it sees the room has made space for it, warm and undemanding. The harbour outside has always known this trick. The tide comes because it sees the shore waiting. Your shore is ready. Your tide is turning. Let the story set down its satchel. Let the night turn its lantern down another notch. And let your breath choose the work it was always good at. In and out and home again. Slower with each pass, until the room forgets to keep count and the counting no longer needs you at all. Sleep well and good night.